Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of, What If the Avengers Watched the Winter Soldier? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Alright. So, updating this original chapter years later, I am currently rewriting this. So it's not exactly the new version anymore. A lot of this original FIC is badly written and I'm unable to pick it up where I left off due to how much my writing style and skill has changed and improved. I won't be deleting this or anything, but I just wanted to make it better known that I haven't abandoned this, just started redoing it, but better. Again. It won't happen again, I swear. The Acid blinked awake, his icy blue eyes widening as he took in his surroundings. He wasn't in the bleak headquarters he'd for so long called his home. Even though Hydra hardly counted as a home, more like a prison. A place he'd never truly be free, but yet he remained for lack of other choice. And besides, where would he go? He was a weapon, not a businessman. He had no right to even think about comparing himself to his handlers. He was just an asset. A tool to be used by its owner. The gun or knife would never own the man who held it. That was just absurd. Wrong. The asset shook his head, clearing it of his thoughts. He quickly slipped into the mindset of the Winter Soldier, becoming emotionless, hard as stone. He looked around, taking in his surroundings. He was in a large room. Tall walls, black as night. Chairs were lined neatly up, facing a large screen. It reminded the Acid of a theater, which he hadn't been in since, well, he didn't know when. It was a memory from before he was the Acid, or Winter Soldier. Back when he'd been, well, he didn't know who he'd been. As he tried to trace down a name, surname, or anything, his eyes caught a slight movement. The Acid spun around quickly, lightning fast, grabbing for a gun only to realize he didn't have one. The Acid briefly looked down. He was wearing his black combat suit, but his weapons, where gone? Made science. Hydra didn't just let him waltz around with a gun in his hands. Without direct orders, the Acid would reset to a more rebellious nature. The Acid knew this, and without any orders right now, well, he was already feeling more alive than he had in ages. He was also a lot easier distracted, darn it. The Acid's enhanced eyesight quickly sought out the movement and found it. The movement belonged to a human, a man. The Acid watched him from the shadows. As he watched, he noticed more movement, more humans. He slunk further into the shadows, concealing himself. He could take the humans quickly, even without a gun or knife. But he didn't have to, and he didn't really want to. But if one of them did see him, or make a move towards him, he would, in fact, kill them. Without thought or regret. One of the humans, a female with flaming red hair, spoke up. "Stark," she said sharply, "is this your doing?" The Acid recognized her, a faint memory of shooting at her. Had she been a target? No, she wouldn't be alive then. He had been shooting someone through her. He would be wary, watch her every move. Another human turned towards the women. He had brown hair and a goatee. He looked hauntingly familiar. "No, Natasha. Why would I do that? And if I did, in fact do that, I would have taken us somewhere. Or, I don't know, interesting," the man said with an arrogant look on his face. The Acid watched that man carefully. He looked familiar, and that was never good. He would be ready to kill the goatee man in an instant if needed be. The redhead Natasha stepped forward, glared at the goatee man and kneeled down. The Acid watched, looking over Natasha and goatee, taking in how they moved, watching for any weakness. Natasha was helping another figure up. This one had light brown hair and the figure of an archer. "Nat, where are we?" the maybe archer asked, turning around in a slow circle. "Not a clue," Natasha answered, and goatee just shrugged when maybe archer looked towards him. The Acid watched with growing concern as another figure stood up, the one with graying hair and glasses. The Acid raised his eyebrows. How many humans were there? And why was no one in charge? Hydra had a pecking order, that was for sure. Didn't all humans have pecking orders? He really needed to do some research or ask someone. Scratch that, Rumlow would flay him if he asked something like that, or anything, for that matter. He shuddered at that thought. Even though Hydra wiped his memory, they always let him remember the chair and the beatings. His attention snapped back as a new, dominant voice entered the human's conversation. This must be the Alpha. Where are we? The voice said. Goatee turned to look down at the floor. Ah, rise and shine, Capsicle. The man said annoyingly. The asset's brow furrowed. No one with a brain would talk to their superior like that. He wouldn't dream of saying something like that to the boss. The man Capsicle stood up. He was tall, with blonde hair. The asset nearly fell backwards. He had seen this man before. No, more than seen, known. He'd known this man before, long, long before. And it was disorienting. The feeling of recognition was so strong, the asset was sure he would have felt it even if he was on orders, and that was saying something. Stark. The blonde man said, giving Goatee Man a stern look. Goatee rolled his eyes. The graying man Bruce, if the asset had listened to the conversation right. Maybe the archer guy was Bruce, he didn't really care. We don't know where we are, maybe Bruce said to Capsicle, turning towards the blonde. We just woke up here, the only guess we have is that someone kidnapped us. Any ideas, Steve? The asset felt an odd jolt through his body. Steve. He knew that name, like he'd known the man. Steve. Why did this name mean so much to his former self? Who was Steve? Why did he feel like he should know this Steve? Steve nodded towards Bruce. I'd assume we had to have been kidnapped. Just be ready for anything, the blonde said, turning to look at maybe Archer and Natasha. Have either of you ever seen anything like this before? The two shook their heads. Sorry, Cap, but nothing like this has ever happened before. Tony doesn't know anything either. The maybe Archer said, glancing over at Goatee Man. The asset nodded his head, so Goatee was Tony. The asset nearly jumped out of his skin when a snapping noise filled the room. The humans did too. Hello, said a cheerful female voice. The asset looked around wildly for the source of the voice but couldn't find anything. Where are you? Exclaimed Steve, looking around crazily, as the asset had a few moments ago. Suddenly, a girl appeared. She had wavy blonde, brown and tan streaks in her hair, and the palest skin he'd ever seen. Here, she said with a cheery voice. Who are you? Tony said, stepping forward. The asset prepared himself to fight, if need be. Myself, she said with a sweet smile and sarcasm lashing her voice. The asset saw Steve roll his eyes at that comment. Why did you take us here? The blonde asked the girl, with a stern look. The girl huffed, but complied. I took you here so you could watch your near future. There are some events I wish to prevent from happening. So I brought you guys and a special friend who really needs to stop lurking in the shadows. She said. The asset felt that comment was very pointed. The humans in the room looked exceedingly uncomfortable, glancing into the darkness around them. The girl huffed and glared right at him, like she could see him, or something. Seriously, dude. Stop lurking, you're killing me. And you're scaring them, it's rude, the girl said with a smirk. The asset looked the girl over. She wasn't Hydra, and she didn't look like a threat. There was no reason for him to listen to her, none at all. But she seemed to be in charge here, it would be smarter to just comply. The longer he stood there, the harder it was for him not to obey. He never just didn't listen to commands. He remembered a time, in the early days, when Hydra had only just got him, when he had rebelled. He remembered the beatings that had followed, remembered every lash had only happened yesterday. He remembered the feeling of being helpless as they broke his bones and lashed him with knives. Even when he'd stopped rebelling, if he ever failed at anything they did. Even when he did nothing wrong, they hurt him. And he hated it, not the pain. He could deal with the pain but the helplessness was what got him, every time. The only thing worse than the beatings, was the Cyro tank. The feeling of being frozen alive was just too much for him. So, with all of that hanging over his head, he quickly raised a hand to his face making sure his mask was on. It wasn't stepped out of the shadows. He was as tense as a coil, ready to attack at a moment's notice. Natasha stumbled back a little, before dropping into a defensive crouch. The other humans noticed the redhead's reaction and fell into battle poses. The girl rolled her eyes. Seriously, no one can hurt anyone. No one has any weapons. And the metal arm won't hurt anyone. Just sit, all of you. Now. The girl's normally calm voice became stern as she waved them towards the seats. Natasha shook her head. But that's the Winter Soldier, he's not going to just not kill us, she exclaimed, glaring at the girl. He won't kill anyone. Honestly, he's more like a kicked puppy than a killer whale. The girl said lightly, smirking at the asset's offended look, which was hard to see because of his mask, but his eyes must have given him away. Sure, Natasha said, looking very unconvinced. The asset looked over the humans. This was going to be a very long day. What would Hydra have him do? That was a stupid question. They'd have him kill them. Obviously. The asset decided to just keep his head down, and not speak. Just act like he always acted towards his handlers. Just sit down, the girl said with a grumble, glaring at everyone until they sat amusing. Really? The asset himself complied, sitting down and ending up next to Steve, which bothered him. If he remembered this Steve, wouldn't Steve recognize him? But, the asset was wearing a mask, that would surely make it harder to recognize him, right? Next to Steve sat Natasha, and after her came Bruce, then Tony, and maybe Archer. The girl let out a sigh of relief as they sat down, though, the asset swore he saw her eyeing his tense form with irritation. Now, if you'd kindly all not kill each other, that would be deeply appreciated, the girl said, eyeing Natasha and then Tony. No matter how annoying Stark is. And with that said, the girl disappeared. The screen flickered to life. The screen showed Sam Wilson is jogging around Washington, D.C. when Steve quickly catches up to him and runs past him. Steve Rogers. On your left. As Sam continues to jog, Steve comes around again quickly after doing another lap. Steve Rogers. On your left. Sam Wilson. On my left. Got it. The humans snickered at their friend leader. The asset almost groaned. Why couldn't they have a clear hierarchy like Hydra did? Not that the asset wanted them to be like Hydra. He hated Hydra, but he had no choice but to comply. After all, without them, who would make sure he didn't overstep his bounds? Who would keep him in line? Who would fix his arm when it glitched? He was trapped, and he knew it. It didn't really matter though, he was a weapon, nothing more. He had no right to want or get freedom. The asset shook his head, shaking away the thoughts. It was odd, that when he had no orders to follow, that his mind always went down these rabbit holes. As Sam is still jogging, Steve comes around again from behind him from another lap. Sam Wilson. Don't say it, don't you say it, Steve Rogers, on your left. Sam Wilson. Come on, once again. The humans snickered at the now blushing Steve. The asset bit back a huff of amusement. Now that was an odd feeling. Kind of light and airy. Like all his troubles had just vanished. He shrunk into his seat. In one way, being with Hydra was easy. He always knew what to expect, what to do. He was used to the feelings, rage, pain and fear. But here, he didn't know what to feel. He didn't feel any rage, nor any pain. Maybe a little fear, but other than that the other feelings were so abnormal, but oddly familiar, like he'd felt them before. Sam gets angry and tries to catch up to him, but only after a few seconds he's unable to carry and stops to rest. As Sam is resting, catching his breath sitting by a tree, Steve walks over to him. Steve Rogers. Need a medic? Tony looked over at Steve with a fake shocked look. Did Cap just use sarcasm? Is the world ending? The man said with a dramatic flourish of his arms at the blonde, who was glaring at him. The asset watched with confusion. Why did they talk to each other like that? Hydra never talked like that. And once again, the asset had a sense of recognition, like he'd done it before. Another thing from the before, the asset assumed. I can use sarcasm, Stark. And I have before. Steve growled at Tony, or was he Stark? Honestly, the asset was at a lose on how to act. Maybe he should just called Tony by Stark, after all, Steve had. And the asset still felt a strong sense of recognition to the blonde. So surely it'd be better to act as Steve did, right? Not that the asset intended to talk to them, but if he did. Sam laughs. Sam Wilson. I need a new set of lungs. Dude, you just ran like 13 miles in 30 minutes. Steve Rogers. I guess I got a late start. Sam Wilson. Oh, really? You should be ashamed of yourself. You should take another lap. The asset watched as Stark looked over at Steve again. I like this dude. The man stated. Who is he? Steve shrugged. I've never met him. The girl did say we'd be watching our near future, so. The blonde trailed off, shrugging. While the humans jumped into a conversation about the running fellow, the asset noticed that Natasha never took her eyes off of him. She was watching him like a hawk. He knew why. If this was the humans' near future, why was he in it? And he remembered shooting someone through her, so he could imagine what her thoughts on the matter were. He hesitates for a moment before saying sarcastically, "Sam Wilson. Did you just take it? I assumed you just took it." At this, Stark cracked up, as did maybe Archer. The acid really needed to learn that guy's name. "Oh, he's perfect," cackled Stark, madly. The acid surprised himself with a sarcastic thought regarding the man's sanity. He was shocked. He hadn't had a thought like that since the before. But he knew he'd had thoughts like that in the past, far back in the past. Like really, really far back. "Steve Rogers, what unit you with?" "Sam Wilson, 58, pararescue. But now I'm working down at the VA." Sam lifts hand to shake. "Sam Wilson, Sam Wilson. Finally, a name," exclaimed maybe Archer, smiling widely and earning a disapproving glance from Natasha before the woman turned her sharp green eyes back on the acid. "I'm with Clint on this one. It's nice to know the guy's name," Steve said, grinning slightly. Clint. Finally a name to go with the face. Now the acid could call him, maybe Archer Clint. Steve gives Sam a hand to rise. "Steve Rogers, Steve Rogers." "Sam Wilson. Yeah, I kind of put that together. Must have freaked you out coming home after the whole defrosting thing." Defrosting? Had Steve been in Cyro Freeze too? That would explain why the acid seemed to know him, if he'd been frozen, never aging just as the acid had. That was one of the worst things about Hydra. He had been with them for what, 60 years? And he'd only aged about 3. Mainly because they only ever took him out for missions, and those only lasted about, what, a week at tops? Maybe add a day or two on for repairs and beatings? The fact was that the acid doubted he'd ever die of old age, and no one had managed to kill him yet. He knew he'd never be free, but death would be its own kind of freedom from the clutches of Hydra. "Steve Rogers. It takes some getting used to. It's good to meet you, Sam." As Steve turns to leave, "Sam Wilson, it's your bed, right?" "Steve Rogers. What's that?" "Sam Wilson. Your bed, it's too soft. When I was over there I'd sleep on the ground and use rock for pillows, like a caveman. Now I'm home, lying in my bed, and it's like Steve Rogers. Lying on a marshmallow. Feel like I'm gonna sink right to the floor." "What's a marshmallow?" the acid thought to himself as Stark looked over at Steve. "We can get you a new bed if your current bed isn't up to your standards," the man said snarkily, though the acid thought he caught a hint of concern in Stark's voice. "No, it's fine. I'd better just get used to it," Steve said, giving a half smile to Stark. The acid's original thought flew through his head again, and before he could stop himself he blurted it out in a quiet voice, making the humans jump out of their skin. "What's a marshmallow?" he said before he could stop himself, instantly regretting it. What had he been thinking? Hydra or not, Steve seemed to be the head of the hierarchy here. Would the blonde punish him for his impudence? The acid knew he wouldn't try and stop the blonde. Following orders was all he really knew how to do. The answer to his stupid question surprised him. You don't know what a marshmallow is?" Stark asked with a surprised look. The acid felt even stupider. Apparently a marshmallow was something he should know. Steve seemed to catch on to the acid's discomfort, and explained. "It's a kind of food. White, fluffy, chewy, sweet," he said in a patient voice. So, the blonde wouldn't punish him. This was so odd. Did this Steve not harm or punish something when it malfunctioned? At least he knew what a marshmallow was. Unsure how to respond to the blonde's unexpected kindness, the acid just gave him a short nod. Sam smiles and nods his head. "Steve Rogers. How long?" "Sam Wilson. 2 tours." Awkward silence. "Sam Wilson. You must miss the good old days, huh?" "Steve Rogers. Well, things aren't so bad. Food's a lot better, we used to boil everything. No polio is good. Internet, so helpful. I've been reading that a lot trying to catch up." Sam looks up to think and raises finger. "Sam Wilson. Marvin Gaye, 1972, Troubleman, soundtrack. Everything you've missed jammed into one album." The acid marked down that information into his head. If he ever got free, which he wouldn't, he would make sure to find this internet and use it to learn of things like marshmallows and Marvin Gaye, whoever that was. "Steve Rogers. I'll put it on the list." "You have a list?" Stark asked with great pleasure and amusement in his voice. Steve rolled R man. Of course I have a list. I was frozen for nearly 70 years. The blonde exclaimed, glaring at Stark, who just smirked. I had a list too, when I first joined S.H.I.E.L.D. Natasha offered helpfully, coming to the blonde's rescue. The Asset watched them interact with interest. He hardly ever saw human interaction, besides Hydra. He didn't have much time on missions to stop and watch them all go about their days. He honestly had no clue if these humans interacted normally, or if this was weird. Steve gets his small notebook and pen out and notes it down on his list, which also includes, in the American version of the movie, I Love Lucy, television, moon landing. Berlin Wall, up plus down, Steve Jobs, Apple, disco. Thai food. Star Wars, Trek. With Star Wars crossed out, indicating that he has seen it, Nirvana, band, Rocky, Rocky 2. You're gonna need a better list than that, Capsicle, Stark said, amusement lacing his voice. Shut up, Stark, Steve said with a glare at the other man. I'm afraid he's right, maybe Archer, Clint said with a smirk. Natasha snickered, while Bruce just shook his head at them all. Steve gets a text message. Mission alert. Extraction imminent. Meet at the curb, smiley face. Steve Rogers. All right, Sam, duty calls. Thanks for the run, if that's what you want to call running. Ooh, burn. Maybe Archer, Clint said, clapping his hands together once. Stark snickered, while Natasha, Bruce and Steve just shook their heads. The Asset watched their interaction closely. Is this how friends acted? What even are friends? They shake hands. Sam Wilson. Oh, that's how it is. Steve Rogers. Oh, that's how it is. Didn't know you had it in you, Captain. Natasha said, smirking at Steve's glare. The Asset felt the odd airy light feeling again. Sam Wilson. He laughs. Okay. Anytime you want to stop by the VA, make me look awesome in front of the girl at the front desk, just let me know. Steve Rogers. I'll keep it in mind. Sam Wilson. Okay. Just then Natasha pulls up in her car by the curb and rolls down the window. Natasha Romanoff. Hey, fellas. Either one of you know where the Smithsonian is? I'm here to pick up a fossil. Stark gave Natasha a high five at that, snickering with maybe Archer Clint as Steve rolled his eyes. The Asset was confused. Steve didn't look like a fossil. He had seen fossils before, and they normally weren't alive. Steve Rogers. That's hilarious. Steve walks over to her car and gets in. Sam gives Natasha and her car an appreciative look. Sam Wilson. How you doing? Stark snorted. Is he trying to flirt with Nat? Natasha in question just shrugged. The Asset was once again confused. What was flirt? Maybe he should make a list. Natasha Romanoff. Hey, Steve Rogers, can't run everywhere. Sam Wilson. No, you can't. It has been brought to my attention by me that I have been spelling marshmallow wrong. My deepest apologies, dear readers. I am too lazy to go fix this error. Also, thanks to anyone reading this. It means a lot to me. Also, to the wonderful Fern Kelly. Thank you for the review. I sadly won't be continuing the old version, but I'll leave it up so you can reread it if you want. I will try to keep the chapters coming. Also, thanks to everyone who was reading my old story, and came over here to read this. PaleWolfsHowl. P.S. This will not be Steve, Bucky. This is purely a friendship fanfiction. I just want to clear that up, because I don't want to have to deal with those reviews. So just so everyone knows, smiley face. Steve had been having a nice day, a perfectly normal, nice day. One second he was taking a nice jog through the streets of New York, the next second he found himself in a room with the other Avengers, a trained killer and an annoying girl. He didn't know what had surprised him more, the fact that some random girl had kidnapped them, or that the supposedly trained killer's first words had been, "What's a marshmallow?" He decided to settle on the later of the two. Like, what lethal man asks that question? It wasn't even mildly scary. Throughout the watching, he had been closely watching the assassin. Something about the guy was just so familiar, hauntingly. Steve knew he should recognize the soldier, but with the mask obscuring his face. And after all, Steve didn't know anyone well that was alive besides the other Avengers. There was no reason he should know this assassin. No reason at all. But yet, Steve knew he had once known this man. So, with this odd sense of familiarity, he had watched the other man's every move. So he had noticed when the assassin had stiffened in fear after he had spoken that one time. He watches as Natasha quickly pulls away and drives off. Flying over the Indian Ocean, the duo are with SHIELD agents, led by Brock Rumlow. Steve nearly jumped out of his seat as the trained assassin next to him burst into a fit of coughing. Looking over at the mask-wearing man, he caught the look of pure terror in the assassin's icy blue eyes. The assassin's whole body was shaking in hysteria. It was rather concerning. Was the guy having a mental breakdown? The even more shocking thing was that Steve had an odd impulse to reach out and try to comfort the other man. Which didn't make sense. Why would he want to comfort a random assassin? Steve shook his head, trying to clear it of the brotherly protective instinct that had come from nowhere. "Are you okay?" he asked awkwardly, trying not to reach out and grab the man's shoulders. The assassin managed to stop coughing for a second, pausing as if in thought, then shaking his head. Steve didn't know if he was trying to say no, or just trying to clear his head of thoughts. Steve glanced to his side and saw the other Avengers watching the interaction with trepidation. The assassin finally managed to calm himself, taking a few deep breaths, before sinking as far back into his seat as humanly possible. Brock Rumlow. The target is a mobile satellite launch platform, the Lemurian Star. They were sending up their last payload when pirates took them, 93 minutes ago. Out of the corner of his eye, Steve could have sworn he saw the assassin flinch at Rumlow's voice. He must have met Rumlow before, and their encounter most likely didn't go well. The captain thought grimly, glancing once again at the pale-faced assassin. "Steve Rogers. Any demands?" Brock Rumlow. $1.5 billion. Steve nor the other Avengers had anything to say to that, so they just kept their yappers shut, for once. "Steve Rogers. Why so steep?" Brock Rumlow. "Because it shields." Steve Rogers. "So it's not off course, it's trespassing." Natasha Romanoff. "I'm sure they have a good reason." Steve Rogers. "You know, I'm getting a little tired of being Fury's janitor." Natasha Romanoff. "Relax, it's not that complicated." Steve Rogers. "How many pirates?" Brock Rumlow. 25, top mercs, led by this guy, Georges Batroc. He shows them a photo of Batroc on the monitor. Brock Rumlow. ex-DGSE, Action Division. He's at the top of Interpol's Red Notice. Before the French demobilized him, he had 36 kill missions. This guy's got a representative for maximum casualties. Steve Rogers. Hostages? Brock Rumlow. Mostly techs. One officer, Jasper Sidwell. He pulls up Sidwell's photo on the monitor. The assassin once again began coughing, earning looks of trepidation and concern, which was from Steve. "Do you know him?" Steve asked the metal-armed man, doubting the assassin would reply. To his shock, the assassin nodded his head. There was a pause before. "Hydra," the assassin said quietly, "he's from Hydra." Steve looked at the Winter Soldier with confusion in his blue eyes. Hydra was dead. He had defeated Hydra nearly 70 years ago. "Hydra's gone. I took it down nearly 70 years ago," Steve stated, voicing his thoughts. The assassin shook his head. "No, kill one head, 2 more shall take its place," the assassin stated in an emotionless voice. "Hydra is very much alive. It lurks within every corner of this forsaken world." And with that, the assassin looked back towards the screen. Steve was in a state of shock. He had failed. He had failed, and Bucky had died for no good reason. He sucked in a deep breath at that thought. Bucky, his best friend and brother and everything but blood, had died for no reason. A flashback of Bucky falling found its way into his head. Bucky's screams as he fell to his unstoppable doom. Steve fought to keep tears from falling from his eyes. Captain America did not cry. He couldn't be seen as weak, ever. Bucky had fallen only 1 month before Steve took down the Red Skull, and then been frozen over. And even in his last 5 years of being defrosted, he still hadn't gotten over the death of his brother. No one could. He normally just pushed all thoughts of Bucky away. The pain that accompanied those thoughts. Steve just couldn't take it. Not at all. Losing Bucky had been like losing a leg. He would never fully heal from the wound of his best friend's death. They'd promised they'd be with each other, until the end of the line. But it meant nothing, because Bucky had fallen, and it was Steve's fault. He should have saved him. No matter what Peggy said, it was his fault. The assassin ended up being the one to yank Steve from his increasingly depressing thoughts. "Wait, you're Captain America?" the assassin asked cautiously, looking over towards Steve warily. Steve gave a short nod. "Brock Rumlow. They're in the galley. Steve Rogers. What's Sitwell doing on a launch ship? Alright, I'm gonna sweep the deck and find Batroc. Nat, you'll kill the engines and wait for instructions. Rumlow, you sweep aft, find the hostages, get them to the life pods, get 'em out. Let's move. Brock Rumlow. Strike, you heard the cap, gear up." As they're getting ready to dive off the jet, into his radio. Steve Rogers. Talking into his wrist communicator, secure channel 7. Natasha Romanoff. 7 secure. Did you do anything fun Saturday night? Steve Rogers. Well, all the guys from my barbershop quartet are dead, so, no, not really. Pilot. On radio, coming up by the drop zone, Cap. Natasha Romanoff. You know, if you ask Kristen out, from statistics, she'd probably say yes. Steve had to roll his eyes at that. Natasha had been trying to set him up for a while now. It was both amusing and annoying. Tony snickered at the captain's bad luck, and Clint high-fived the smirking Natasha. Steve Rogers. That's why I don't ask. Natasha Romanoff. Too shy or too scared? Steve Rogers. Too busy. Steve jumps out of the jet. Strike agent. Was he wearing a parachute? Rumlow smiles. Brock Rumlow. No, he wasn't. Steve could have sworn he saw the assassin's eyes twitch in amusement at that comment. Though he still seemed upset about Rumlow, the assassin seemed to find amusement in the thought of Steve jumping from a plane without a parachute. Steve dives into the ocean and then climbs onto the ship. He then beats everyone on the deck swiftly before anyone raises the alarm when he's interrupted by one of the pirates pointing his gun at him. French pirate number 1. Bougez pas. Don't move, don't move. He's shot dead by Rumlow as he parachutes down onto the deck behind Steve. Steve Rogers. Thanks, Brock Rumlow. Yeah, you seemed pretty helpless without me. Steve now noticed that the assassin winced. He really wanted to know when the two had met before. This Winter Soldier seemed terrified of Brock. He also wanted to know why he felt so protective of this assassin. Natasha and another agent parachute down onto the deck to join them. Natasha Romanoff. What about the nurse that lives across the hall from you? She seems kind of nice. Steve Rogers. Secure the engine room, then find me a date. Natasha Romanoff. I'm multitasking. This was met with howls of laughter from the Avengers, and a confused look from the assassin. Natasha jumps down to the lower deck. Below deck we see the pirates are holding the ship's crew, including Sitwell, hostage. French pirate number 1. J'ai dit Batroc KC on ver que le shield nous paye. Commence à leur envoyer des corps maintenant, subtitled, I said to Batroc, if we want shield to pay, we have to start sending them bodies now. Delightful, aren't they? Tony said, sarcasm lacing his voice. Steve huffed in amusement, though it was half-hearted, half his mind still thinking about Bucky. Sure are. Clint said, but before the two could really get started, the timid Bruce spoke up. If you two don't pay attention, we'll never finish this. He said quietly, nodding towards the two now pouting Avengers. Steve glanced over at the assassin to see him looking confused. Had this man never seen banter before? Never joined in on a silly conversation? To the hostages, une balle pour quelqu'un, subtitled, I have a bullet for someone, shouting in English. You want a bullet in your head? Tien ver un. Hein, do you want one? Eh? He kicks one of the hostages' leg. Bougez ton pied. Tu veux une balle dans la tête? Subtitled, move that leg. Want a bullet in your head? Steve felt indignation for the poor hostages who had to go through this trauma. It would scar them for life. Meanwhile on the deck Steve moves quickly to find the hostages, in the control room. Georges Batroc. J'aime pas attendre. Appel Durand. Je veux que l'on s'arrache dès que la rançon arrive. Subtitled, I do not like to wait. Call Durand. I want the ship ready to move when the ransom arrives. French pirate. Oui, Batroc. Subtitled, yes, Batroc. He makes the call, French pirate. Durand. Démarre le moteur. Subtitled, Durand. Start the engine. Durand. Okay. Durand puts the phone down, turns and sees Natasha behind him. "Oh good grief, Nat. You're going to give someone heart failure," Clint exclaimed, smirking at his fellow spy, who shrugged. "It'd make the job go quicker," the former Russane assassin said cheerfully, fluttering her eyes at her best friend mockingly. Steve noticed the assassin nodding his head lightly, as if he agreed with Natasha. Great. Perfect. It was never good when someone agreed with the SHIELD agent. Natasha Romanoff. "Hey, sailor." She quickly knocks him down and manages to swing down below deck, shooting several of the pirates on the way. To one of the hostages, French pirate, Ferme ta gueule, subtitled, "Shut up." French pirate number 1. Bougez pas toi, mais qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Tu veux jouer les héros, c'est quoi, t'ai pas intérêt, subtitled, "What is it, want to be a hero?" He looks at the hostages who keep their heads down. French pirate number 1. Bon, j'ai trop attendu là, subtitled, "Well, I've waited long enough." He goes over to the locked door and bangs on it to get the attention of the pirate guarding outside. French pirate number 1. Hey, trouvez Batroc, si j'ai pas de nouvelles dans 2 minutes, je commence à les tuer. Subtitled, "Hey, look for Batroc. If I do not hear anything in 2 minutes, I'll start to kill them." The Avengers grew tense. They hated seeing things like this and being unable to help. It was awful. They just had to believe in future Natasha and Steve to get the hostages in time. Steve had always hated injustice, and to see it right in front of him, but be unable to help, that was awful. The feeling of helplessness, like when he'd been unable to catch Bucky when he fell. Except no pain could match what he'd felt when Bucky had fallen. No injury nor death could ever hurt him so much. He shook his head. These thoughts got him nowhere. French pirate number 2. D'accord. Je vais le chercher. Subtitled, "Okay. I'll find him." As the pirate turns to leave, Rumlow, who's standing behind him with a stun gun, shoots him. On the other side of the door, the other pirate senses something but dismisses it. French pirate number 1. 2 minutes. Subtitled, 2 minutes. We see Rumlow and another strike agent places a bomb on the locked door. In the control room, French pirate, silence radio du SHIELD, Batroc. Subtitled, radio silence from SHIELD, Batroc. Steve watches them from the deck. We see another strike agent getting in position. Strike agent. Targets acquired. Below deck, Rumlow points his gun at the bomb placed against door where the hostages are being kept. Brock Rumlow. Strike in position, into his radio. Steve Rogers. Natasha, what's your status? I think I'm a little busy, Steve. The redhead said, while watching the screen. Steve just huffed at the spy. We see Natasha jumping down below deck to knock out one of the pirates. See, busy. Natasha said brightly, smirking at Clint, who seemed to be enjoying the scene just as much as his fellow Avenger and agent. Steve Rogers. Status, Natasha? Natasha Romanoff. Hang on. As the pirate attacks her, she quickly knocks him out, into her radio. Natasha Romanoff. Engine room secure. Steve just sighed. He was supposed to be the captain, though he highly doubted Tony would ever listen to him. He and Tony had gotten off to a bad start. Seeing as Howard had spent all of Tony's life trying to find the still frozen Steve, the bilinear had always resented the captain. Steve had been very upset when he'd learned of what Howard had done. While he appreciated the loyalty, Howard should have been taking care of his son, not looking for lost war heroes. Natasha grabs a pipe from the ground and knocks out one of the pirates. French pirate number 1. Le temps est écoulé. Qui veut mourir en premier? Hey toi, prends la fille. Subtitled, Time's up. Who wants to die first? To one of his men, hey, you, take the girl. Into his radio, oh goodness, they had better hurry. If Steve or the strike team arrived even a second too late, then that's a life lost. Steve Rogers. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. The strike team starts shooting at the pirates, blow open the door, and Rumlow quickly kills the head pirate. Jasper Sidwell. I told you, SHIELD doesn't negotiate. Neither does Hydra. The assassin muttered quietly, thought Steve heard him, and glanced over towards the other man curiously. It seemed that the assassin knew a lot about Hydra. Though, it wouldn't make sense for him to be Hydra, after all, he'd betrayed them. giving out the fact that Hydra was indeed still a thing. Back in the control room, one of Batroic's men tries to get hold of the pirate below deck. French pirate. Hello, je pense que la ligne est morte. J'ai perdu le contact. Subtitled, Hello, Batroic, the line is dead. I lost contact with them. Just then Steve smashes in through the window using his shield, but Batroic manages to escape. To Steve as he goes looking for Batroic. Brock Rumlow. Hostages en route to extraction. Romanoff missed the rendezvous point, Cap. Hostiles are still in play. Steve Rogers. Natasha, Batroic's on the move. Circle back to Rumlow and protect the hostages. Steve saw Entach's brow furrow then smooth over. I must be on a double mission, she said with a shrug, as if this didn't matter. Without telling me. Steffi was the leader of the mission. He should know if one of the agents is performing more than one task. I'm multitasking, the SHIELD agent said annoyingly, smirking at Steve's annoyed look. There's no reply from Natasha. Steve Rogers. Natasha. Suddenly Batroic attacks Steve. They fight on the deck of the ship, with Batroic getting quickly back up on his feet. Georges Batroic. Je croyais que tu étais plus qu'un bouclier. Subtitled. I thought that you were more than just a shield. Steve puts the shield on his back and takes off his mask. Steve Rogers. On va voir. Subtitled. Let's see. Steve flushed as Bruce started grumbling about reckless teammates taking unnecessary risks, making the other Avengers snicker. They start fighting again. Steve manages to finally knock Batroic down by smashing through into one of the rooms where Natasha is downloading something from the computer. Natasha Romanoff. Well, this is awkward. Steve Rogers. What are you doing? Downloading data? Natasha said with a shrug, looking over at Steve who just frowned at her. Natasha Romanoff. Backing up the hard drive. It's a good habit to get into. Steve Rogers. Rumlow needed your help. What the hell are you doing here? Steve goes over to Natasha and looks at what Natasha is backing up. Steve Rogers. You're saving SHIELD intel. Natasha Romanoff. Whatever I can get my hands on. Of course you are. I mean, why not? It's not like our mission was to rescue the hostages or something. Steve said with a glare at Natasha. No, that was your mission. Mine was to collect data, Natasha said, looking regretless. Steve Rogers. Our mission is to rescue hostages. Natasha Romanoff. No, that's your mission. Don't repeat yourselves, Tony said, smirking at Natasha and Steve's disgruntled expressions. She finishes backing up and pulls the flash drive out. Natasha Romanoff. And you've done it beautifully. As Natasha goes to leave, Steve grabs her arm. Steve Rogers. You just jeopardized this whole operation. Natasha Romanoff. I think that's overstating things. Suddenly Batroic rises and throws a grenade at the two as he runs off. Steve deflects the bomb with his shield, grabs Natasha and jumps through a window before it explodes. Natasha Romanoff. Okay, that one's on me. You don't say, grumbled Steve, half-heartedly glaring at the agent. Ah, we've had worse before, she said with a shrug as Clint and Tony snickered. Steve Rogers. You're damn right. Okay, so another note. Yay, so just to clear this up, this fanfiction is taking place before Age of Ultron, so Clint's family hasn't been introduced yet, and I ship Clintasha, so deal with it. Also, I've been typing Bucky's name out as the Acid, so much that when my dad and I were watching Civil War the other night, I accidentally called Bucky the Acid. My dad was so confused. It was hilarious, because I didn't even notice I'd said it for a few minutes. Okay. I'm boring everyone. Oof. This wolf just can't shut up. PaleWolfsHowl. Thank you for the kind reviews, Chronosign. I'm glad you like the new version. I agree that my old version was just too long, smiley face. I think I'm going to be writing this mostly from Bucky's POV. I find it easier than Steve's, lol. PaleWolfsHowl. The Acid was fighting a losing battle at staying calm. Ever since he'd seen his handler, Rumlow, he had been a mess. Every time he heard that voice, flashbacks of agony and pain filled his mind. While the boss was more dangerous, the Acid hated Rumlow the most. The boss normally only hurt the Acid when he messed up on a mission, but Rumlow. Well, Rumlow enjoyed the Acid's pain, and he found the deepest pleasure in causing it. Quite honestly, The acid would rather be in cryo-freeze than in the same room as Rumlow. The acid had to stop himself from reaching for his arm, where a particularly bad scar was hidden. The acid was covered in scars, all along his torso, legs and arm. Rumlow always found a way to inflict the most pain possible without damaging the acid too much. And Rumlow always made sure that he'd get at least 2 hours with the acid just to see how much pain he could cause. No one ever stopped him. The boss favored Rumlow, so he wouldn't step in and stop Rumlow. The acid sighed, glancing at the captain sitting next to him. Of course Steve would end up being Captain America. Maybe that was why the acid recognized him. Maybe Hydra had shown him pictures or something, but that just didn't fit. The acid knew he had known Steve before Hydra. He shivered, thinking back to the fact that Rumlow had been in the same aircraft as the captain. He didn't like that, not one bit. As the movie had progressed, he had been feeling a growing sense of protectiveness to Steve. It was odd, and wrong. But the acid couldn't help it. He shouldn't care, he should be indifferent, but he just couldn't be. He knew that the captain had meant something to him from before. The acid silently cursed Hydra. It was all their fault. Their fault he didn't know who he was, or who he would have been. Their fault that he was a merciless killer. Their fault that he didn't have any memories of who he had been. Their fault that when given a command he couldn't fight it. And their fault that he didn't know who Steve was. And thinking back to the scene with Rumlow in the same aircraft as the captain. Quite honestly, the acid would prefer Rumlow was in the same room as him, rather than the captain. And that was wrong. He should care more about himself than the captain. He was torn from his thoughts by the movie. The Triskelion, S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters. Steve walks into Fury's office. Steve Rogers. You just can't stop yourself from lying, can you? Nick Fury. I didn't lie. Agent Romanoff had a different mission than yours. The acid heard a quiet groan next to him at that line. Glancing over he saw Steve rubbing a hand over his face in irritation. He quickly looked back at the screen before the captain noticed. Steve Rogers. Which you didn't feel obliged to share. Nick Fury. I'm not obliged to do anything. Ah, good old St. Nicholas. Stark said with a huff of laughter. His comment causing maybe Archer Clint to burst into laughter, while the captain just shook his head at them. Though he saw fondness in Steve's blue eyes. Soon enough, the whole group of humans had burst out into conversation, the movie forgotten. The acid just sat quietly, feeling rather awkward as the group all snickered over random things. Hey, Manchurian Candidate. Do you speak? Stark said suddenly, looking straight at the acid. What was a Manchurian Candidate? Was it like a marshmallow? But that was food. Why would Stark call him food? Should he add the Manchurian Candidate to his mental list? As if sensing the acid's confusion, Steve rolled his eyes at Stark before turning his attention to the acid. Ignore him, was all the captain said. The acid opened his mouth, wanting to ask what a Manchurian Candidate was. Natasha seemed to read his mind, for she answered him before he could speak. It means you're a brainwashed assassin that the government uses to do their evil bidding. The redhead stated, looking straight at the acid. The acid thought about that for a moment. It was pretty accurate. After all, if his guess was right, Hydra was affecting the government. So logically, Stark was right with his comment. The acid knew Stark was most likely trying to offend him, but it was true, so. He opened his mouth again, and praying that the captain wouldn't be angry at him, replied to Stark's comment. Fair enough. He paused, seeing the shock on the humans' faces when he spoke. But, at least I'm not a flying tin can. The acid said quietly. He had been taking notes on how the humans spoke to each other, and they seemed to like saying rude things. He was surprised at how easily he had said it. He hadn't spoken like that since before. And the shocked looks on the humans' faces was worth any punishment the captain might deem him. Suddenly, to the acid's shock, maybe Archer Clint burst out laughing. He's got you there, Tony. The light brown-haired man cackled, then turned to look at the acid. Thank you for that. The acid was stunned. Nobody ever said thanks to him. After all, no one typically thanked a tool. And the reaction that maybe Archer Clint had was so different than Hydra. Hydra would have made him pay for that comment, but these humans. The acid glanced over at the captain cautiously, and to his shock, the blonde was grinning. Maybe, for this short time, until he was back with Hydra, the acid would try and enjoy himself. Make some good memories for Hydra to wipe away. Stark was staring at the acid, before finally speaking, "Touché." After all, what the acid had said was true. The acid knew who Tony Stark was. Hydra had told him a while back. Steve Rogers. Those hostages could have died, Nick. Nick Fury. I sent the greatest soldier in history to make sure that didn't happen. Steve Rogers. Soldiers trust each other, that's what makes it an army. Not a bunch of guys running around and shooting guns. To the asset's shock, that comment made by the captain sent him into a flashback. But not of Hydra. It was from before. The memory formed so quickly and unexpectedly that the asset almost fell out of his seat. The memory was of himself, younger, short-haired, no metal arm, and without his mask. Sitting next to him was a younger-looking Steve, who was nursing a purple bruise on his jaw. The asset's younger self was glaring at the blonde. Soldiers trust each other, Steve. That's what makes it an army, or in our case, a team. Not a bunch of guys running around and shooting guns. Or throwing shields. The asset's younger self said, putting extra force on his last few words. The asset stifled a gasp as the memory ended. So he had known Steve. It seemed like they had been friends. Whoever he had once been, well, he had known the captain. The asset felt more hatred towards Hydra than he had in a long time. He would never get to know who he had been, ever. He might regain a few memories here and there throughout the movie, but he'd be back at Hydra before he ever got them all back. Nick Fury. The last time I trusted someone, I lost an eye. Look, I didn't want you doing anything you weren't comfortable with. Agent Romanoff is comfortable with everything. That I am. Natasha said with a smirk, looking straight at maybe Archer Clint, who was blushing bright red. Stark snickered at the obvious discomfort of the light brown-haired man. Do tell what has Barton as red as a tomato. The Tin Can said with a smirk. None of your business, Tin Can. Maybe Archer Clint said with a smirk, happily reusing the asset's words. Watch it, Legolas. Stop quoting Manchurian Candidate. It's bad for your mental health, Stark said, challenging both maybe Archer Clint and the acid. The acid didn't really know what to say to that, so he just said the first thing that came to mind. Obviously, the Tin Can is just jealous, because my insult was better than his. Seeing at Stark from the corner of his eye. Maybe Archer Clint happily added his own 2 cents. That he is, assassin. The man said with a nod of his head. I hate you all. Stark grumbled. Finally, Steve put a stop to the conversation. Shush. We have to finish this movie sometime, he said sensibly, making maybe Archer Clint pout. You're no fun, Grandpa. Steve Rogers. I can't lead a mission when the people I'm leading have missions of their own. Nick Fury. It's called compartmentalization. Nobody spills the secrets because nobody knows them all. Steve Rogers. Except you. Nick Fury. You're wrong about me. I do share. I'm nice like that. Nick Fury nice. Huh. No, Stark huffed. The humans in the room nodding in agreement. Fury steps into an elevator with Steve following behind him. Nick Fury. Insight Bay. Shield computer. Captain Rogers does not have clearance for Project Insight. Nick Fury. Director override, Fury, Nicholas J. Shield computer, confirmed. The elevator starts moving down. Steve Rogers. You know, they used to play music. Nick Fury. Yeah. My grandfather operated one of these things for 40 years. My granddad worked in a nice building, he got good tips. Nick looks up. Nick Fury. He'd walk home every night, roll of one stuffed in his lunch bag. He'd say, hi. People would say hi back. Time went on, neighborhood got rougher. He'd say, hi. They'd say, keep on steppin'. Granddad got to grippin' that lunch bag a little tighter. Nice story. Maybe Archer Clint said, earning a swat over the head from Natasha, who was glaring at him. The acid bit back a snicker. It shocked him, how much he already changed, after only a half an hour with these humans. He knew as soon as he was back with Hydra it would all be wiped away. He would always be the Winter Soldier, no questions asked. He would never truly be free. Hydra would always own him. Always. But he didn't want to ever go back, he wished he had new handlers. He wouldn't mind if they beat him too, he just didn't want to kill anyone anymore. He would happily comply to a new handler, he would welcome their criticism, or their lashings. He just didn't want to kill anymore. Steve Rogers. Did he ever get mugged? Nick Fury. Every week some punk would say, "What's in the bag?" Steve Rogers. What did he do? Nick Fury. He'd show him. Bunch of crumpled ones and loaded .22 Magnum. Fury smiles. Well, I can see where Fury gets it now, Stark said with a smirk. To the asset's surprise, the fairly quiet Steve spoke up. Yeah, it must run in the blood, paranoia. The blonde huffed, earning a grin from Stark. Nick Fury. Granddad loved people, but he didn't trust them very much. As they continue to ride down the elevator, Steve notices the giant helicarriers. Nick Fury. Yeah, I know. They're a little bit bigger than a .22. As Fury shows Steve round. Nick Fury. This is Project Insight. 3 next-generation helicarriers synced to a network of targeting satellites. Steve Rogers. Launched from the Lemurian Star. Nick Fury. Once we get them in the air, they never need to come down. Continuous suborbital flight courtesy of our new repulsor engines. Huh. Wonder if I helped, Stark said, tilting his head to one side. Steve Rogers. Stark? Nick Fury. Well, he had a few suggestions once he got an up-close look at our old turbines. These new long-range precision guns can eliminate 1,000 hostiles a minute. The satellites can read a terrorist's DNA before he steps outside his spider hole. We are gonna neutralize a lot of threats before they even happen. Steve Rogers. I thought the punishment usually came after the crime. Nick Fury. We can't afford to wait that long. Steve Rogers. Who's we? The asset paled. He had a guess. Hydra had long ago infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D., and he highly doubted this project would go the way Fury wanted it to. If Hydra got their hands on that, a lot of people would die, good people. Like the captain, and maybe Archer Clint. It would be tragic. Nick Fury. After New York, I convinced the World Security Council we needed a quantum surge in threat analysis. For once we're way ahead of the curve. Steve Rogers. By holding a gun at everyone on Earth and calling it protection. The asset knew he had to warn the captain. Gathering up his nerves, he turned to look straight at the blonde. Hydra. He said, nodding towards the screen. Hoping that one word would convey what he meant. All his programming was stopping him from delivering a full outline. Hydra had done a good job of striping away any inkling of freedom. There was nothing left of who he had once been. He was Hydra's fist, and he most likely would end up fighting the captain. But, as long as he had a thread of free will, he would fight against Hydra. He had already gotten a good hit in, when he'd revealed who Rumlow was. Steve paled, realizing what the asset meant. They're gonna use it, aren't they? He questioned the asset after a moment. The asset gave a nod. The Avengers groaned in frustration. Steve looked straight at the asset. Thank you, he said simply. The asset felt like he might smile. The captain's approval meant so much to him, and he didn't even know why. All he knew was that he would rather die than harm the blonde. The asset knew that all of the changes that had occurred in him was all due to Steve. The asset hadn't felt any inkling of joy in almost 70 years. He didn't know how he had once known this man, but he knew he'd die for him without thought or regret. Even if it meant going against Hydra, even if it killed him, he would not betray this man. Nick Fury. You know, I read those SSR files. Greatest Generation? You guys did some nasty stuff. Steve Rogers. Yeah, we compromised. Sometimes in ways that made us not sleep so well. But we did it so the people could be free. This isn't freedom, this is fear. Nick Fury. S.H.I.E.L.D. takes the world as it is, not as we'd like it to be. It's getting damn near past time for you to get with that program, Cap. Never. The captain grumbled so quietly the asset had to strain to hear him. Steve Rogers. Don't hold your breath. Steve turns and walks off. Oh dear, that was a long one. Hope y'all are happy with this chapter. PaleWolfsHowl. And another chapter. Thanks to everyone who has followed, favorited this story. Okay, so I had the asset have a flashback. I accidentally put it in a way that made it seem like the asset was watching from above or something, so I'm just going to pretend that's how flashbacks work, lol. PaleWolfsHowl. The asset sighed, shifting in his seat. Steve takes off on his motorcycle. In the Smithsonian Museum there is an exhibit dedicated to Captain America. Natasha snickered, making everyone look at her. The acid looked at her confused, until he remembered her earlier future self's comment. He huffed, realizing exactly what she was thinking. Understanding dawned on the humans' faces. Maybe Archer Clint burst out into laughter, while Stark smirked. The acid glazed over at Steve, who rolled his eyes at his friends. The Smithsonian narrator. A symbol to the nation. A hero to the world. The story of Captain America is one of honor, bravery and sacrifice. Steve, keeping his face hidden under a baseball cap, walks over to the exhibition. Remarkable disguise, really? Stark snickered at the poorly disguised future Steve. Shut up, the captain muttered in irritation, glaring at Stark. The acid decided to test his ground. He needed to know sooner or later if he could get away with making a snarky comment at the captain. Tin Can's got a point, he said quietly, earning surprised looks from the humans. Great, not only is a walking toaster against me, but an apparently lethal assassin too, the blonde grumbled. The acid surprised himself by smirking under his mask. Or was it a muzzle? Woman on PA. Faintly, welcome to the Smithsonian. Visitor information booths are available on the second level. The Smithsonian narrator. Denied enlistment due to poor health, Stephen Rogers was chosen for a program unique in the annals of American warfare. One that would transform him into the world's first super soldier. A boy recognizes him. Steve smiles, puts his finger against his mouth to indicate for the boy to keep quiet, and the boy nods. Steve then watches some old footage of himself. Old footage recording. In this rare footage, everyone's favorite war hero, Captain America. Steve goes to the display where there are mannequins with costumes of Steve's old commando squad. The Smithsonian narrator. Battle-tested, Captain America and his Howling Commandos quickly earned their stripes. Their mission, taking down Hydra, the Nazi rogue science division. The acid hadn't known that fact about Captain America. The debriefing Hydra had given him on the captain was mostly composed of threat, take down on sight. Steve walks over to the display of his friend Bucky Barnes. The acid stared wide at the image of Bucky Barnes. That man looked exactly as the acid younger self had. His eyes widened farther as he realized that Bucky Barnes was his former self. Oh dear. So that would mean that the acid had served in the American military? As a Howling Commando? At least it cleared up how he knew Steve. So Hydra must have hijacked him at some point? At least he knew who he was, that was good. Next to him, the acid heard Steve take a deep breath as he stared at the screen. He glanced over, to see, were those tears in the captain's eyes? Over whoever the acid had once been? The Smithsonian narrator. Best friends since childhood, Bucky Barnes and Stephen Rogers were inseparable on both schoolyard and battlefield. Barnes is the only Howling Commando to give his life in service of his country. They think I died. The acid realized with a jolt. Next to him, Steve seemed to be struggling to breath. Wait, best friends since childhood? No wonder he recognized the captain. What did his friend even do? Who was in charge in a relationship like that? Steve, you okay? Bruce spoke up for one of the first times since the film had started. The acid, or was he Bucky Barnes now? No, he didn't deserve that name. Glanced over at the captain, who had tears falling from his eyes. The acid's former self must have been important to Steve, really important. The acid wished he could step up and be Bucky Barnes again, for Steve. But he couldn't. He knew he could never be his past self again. Hydra had long ago burned that bridge. With a snapping noise, the girl was back, surprising everyone in the room. Does he look okay? The girl huffed. Waving a hand, and a smaller black screen appeared in front of the large screen. The acid watched as she gestured to the humans, excluding Steve. James Buchanan Barnes was more than Steve's best friend. They were brothers in everything but blood, she said curtly, then turned to the captain. Watch this, or I guess, listen to this, she ordered, and Steve reluctantly raised his eyes to the black screen. With a pop, the girl disappeared. Voices came from the black screen. First was Steve's. You know me. How is this going to help? Grumbled Steve, glaring at the small black screen. The acid tilted his head. If he himself was this Bucky Barnes, then wouldn't his voice come from the screen too? No, I don't. Yup. Though, it was a good thing that his voice from on the screen seemed to be without the filter of the mask. Meaning no one would know that the asset was indeed Barnes. "Bucky. You've known me your entire life. Your name is James Buchanan Barnes." The captain, finally realizing what this was, gasped, as did the other humans. "He's alive," was all Steve said, more tears running down his cheek. The asset watched as the captain repeated that line over and over again. How is this possible?" His question went unanswered, for nobody knew the answer, excluding the asset. The other humans seemed to be having similar thoughts. It took a good 10 minutes for Steve to calm himself. The black screen flickered to life once more. "I wasn't in Vienna, I don't do that anymore." Wait, how could the asset have a choice? Unless he'd gotten away from Hydra. No, that was impossible. What would a weapon do without a handler? He noticed that the humans in the room tilted their heads in confusion. Steve was looking at the screen with heartbreaking hope, obviously just hoping his friend was alive. The asset thought what the girl had done was cruel, giving the captain false hope. Even though the asset was alive, he could never be whomever he had been back in his and Steve's childhood. He didn't even have control of his own mind, showing Steve something that gave him so much hope, only to have it torn away from him. Maybe this girl was Hydra after all, to do something like that. "Well, the people who think you did are coming here now, and they're not planning on taking you alive." The asset tilted his head, wondering what his future self hadn't done. Something bad, it sounded like. Something really bad. Or maybe someone had done some research on the Winter Soldier and realized he needed to be killed. No, his future self's voice had said that he hadn't done it. Was he lying? Or maybe the asset would get blamed for something? That's smart. Good strategy. And with that, the small black screen disappeared. It was. The asset knew that. No one survived who tried to take the asset alive, though, no one survived trying to take him dead either, so. Next to him, Steve looked beyond confused and a tad bit shell-shocked. Why, if in fact, Bucky is alive, would someone want him dead? The captain asked no one in particular. Maybe he committed a crime, Natasha offered helpfully. The captain immediately shook his head at her. Buck wouldn't ever hurt anyone who was innocent, he stated with absolute conviction. The asset bit back a sigh. If only the captain knew. No, he could never, ever know. It would hurt him too much. Well, his screen voice said he didn't do it. Bruce offered kindly. Steve nodded, immediately believing what Bruce had said. The asset was shocked by the absolute trust the captain had in his former self. Steve watches an older-looking Peggy Carter being interviewed. The asset looked towards Steve to see if he showed any outright reaction at the woe captain still looked out of it, still in shock by the reveal of Bucky Barnes' current condition of not being dead. Peggy Carter. That was a difficult winter. A blizzard had trapped half our battalion behind the German line. Steve. At the sound of his name, the captain blinked into somewhat awareness, looking at the screen and seeing the women on it. The image that it showed only seemed to cause the blonde more pain. The asset wanted the image on the screen to go away and stop causing the captain pain. He noticed that other humans in the room were shifting, as if they wanted to say or do something but didn't know what. As the captain trembled with grief, the asset felt something break in him. He was aware of the human's eyes on him as he reached a hand out towards the captain. Not his metal hand, his flesh one. He honestly had no clue what he was doing, but gosh darn it. He knew he had comforted the captain back when he had been Bucky, but he also knew that a trained assassin wasn't exactly comforting. Also, Steve was unaware of the asset's identity crisis. But, the asset couldn't stand just sitting there while the captain was in pain, something he had apparently kept from his former self. So, hoping he didn't make things worse, he reached out and gently rested his hand on the captain's shoulder. There was a tense moment before the captain leaned into the asset's touch. He felt like breathing out in relief, but held it in. He was aware of the shocked looks on Steve's friends' faces. Natasha looked like she might faint. It would have been amusing if the asset hadn't been so stressed that the captain might notice that a lethal nightmare was the one trying to comfort him. The asset started to carefully rub Steve's shoulder, something he vaguely remembered doing as Bucky. More memories were trickling in, not as strong as the first one, but. Steve sighed, relaxing. The asset felt the captain's muscles untensing. Good. After a moment, everyone turned their attention back to the screen. The asset left his hand on Steve's shoulder, rubbing it absent-mindedly. Peggy hesitates. Peggy Carter, Captain Rogers. He fought his way through a Hydra blockade that had pinned our allies down for months. He saved over 1,000 men, including the man who would become my husband as it turned out. Even after he died, Steve was still changing my life. The asset could hear Steve's ragged breaths. The woman on the screen was the cause of it. The asset wished she would go away and stop causing the captain pain. Though, logically the asset knew it wasn't her fault. But, still. Using all the knowledge he had from his life as Bucky Barnes, which wasn't much, the asset ran his hand up and down Steve's arm in a hopefully comforting way. It seemed to work, for the captain settled down a little. The asset was a mix of confused and happy that the captain didn't push him away, or punish him. Steve looks at the photo of Peggy he'd kept in his old compass. Steve visits Peggy, who is now lying sick in bed. The asset had a feeling that Steve would have lost it at that, if he hadn't been rubbing the captain's arm. Obviously, whoever this woman is, she meant a lot to the captain, which meant that the asset would try to protect her too. Which would be hard, but he knew that he could never let Hydra harm the captain. No matter what. Even if he was given direct orders, his loyalty would stay with Steve. Without continuous thought, the asset smoothed his hand over Steve's neck, then down his arm again. The captain seemed to calm a little. The asset assumed it was because the captain would recognize the particular strategy that the asset was using to calm it. After all, the asset was now starting to distantly remember doing this before, in the long nights after someone had died. Steve's mother? The asset wasn't sure. All he knew was that his former self had done this thousands of times. Steve Rogers. You should be proud of yourself, Peggy. Steve looks at Peggy's family photos by her bedside table showing her with her husband and children. Peggy Carter. I have lived a life. My only regret is that you didn't get to live yours. Steve looks sad. The asset wondered if this woman would feel that same about him. If he had known Steve throughout his childhood and days serving in the war, he must have known this woman too. Peggy Carter. What is it, Steve Rogers? For as long as I can remember I just wanted to do what was right. I guess I'm not quite sure what that is anymore. And I thought I could throw myself back in and follow orders, serve. It's just not the same. The asset glanced over at Steve's face. This scene was making him even more depressed, darn it. Peggy chuckles. Peggy Carter. You're always so dramatic. Look, you saved the world. We rather mucked it up. Steve Rogers. You didn't. Knowing that you helped found S.H.I.E.L.D. is half the reason I stay. Peggy takes Steve's hand. Peggy Carter. Hey. The world has changed and none of us can go back. All we can do is our best, and sometimes the best that we can do is to start over. But sometimes you can't start over. The asset knew he would never be able to. Not after everything he had done. Hydra had permanently branded him as their property. He could never start over because he would always be haunted by the ghosts of his past. He could never be free. The weight of his crimes would always overpower him. He knew that when he was sent back to Hydra, all this would be wiped away. He wouldn't know the captain. He wouldn't remember who he had once been. Hydra had wiped it all away once. They could easily do it again. And even if he did remember, they had the code words. He was a slave in his own mind, never to be free, for he could never escape himself. He was a monster crafted by cruel, unfeeling hands. He was sharpened like a blade, for cutting down even the strongest of men. He was a loaded gun, just waiting for someone to push the trigger. He was a weapon, he knew this, but in the presence of Steve, he was beginning to forget it. He needed to remember he was nothing more than a tool in the hands of stronger, more dangerous men. Peggy starts to cough. Steve turns to get her some water and goes to hand it to her. Steve Rogers. Peggy. Suddenly Peggy looks at Steve like she's seeing for the first time since he was frozen. Peggy Carter. Steve? The asset's full attention was snapped back to Steve as he shook at the line. The asset saw Stark's mouth opening, as if to say something, and glared icily at him. Stark shut his mouth quickly. The asset carefully massaged the captain's shoulder and neck. He once again relaxed. Steve Rogers. Yeah. Peggy Carter. You're alive. You came back. Steve Rogers. Yeah, Peggy. Peggy begins to cry. Peggy Carter. It's been so long. So long. The asset was pretty sure everyone winced at that. He, himself winced at what the woman Peggy had said. Steve Rogers. Well, I couldn't leave my best girl. Not when she owes me a dance. Steve grimaced at the line. Since the scene was over, and the captain was no longer in danger of emotional trauma, the acid moved his hand away awkwardly. He was very much aware of Natasha's eyes burning into him. Ah, the 6th chapter already. Goodness. I've been typing like mad for the last 2 days. I hope you people are happy. It's like 2 a.m. right now. Well, it is while I'm writing this. It might be posted tomorrow though. Lol. Also, to reply to the review I was given by MJ, I do intend to continue with these characters after this FIC is done. But I'm doing the Age of Ultron movie because it doesn't fit with my plot. Sorry. Also, IDK where Thor is, he's out of town or something. Now, onto the emotionally distraught characters I must torture for pleasure? PaleWolfsHowl Steve was in a state of shock, for multiple reasons. First of all, it had been revealed to him that his best friend, Bucky, was in fact very much not dead. Which wasn't possible. Steve had watched him fall. There was no way that anyone could survive that fall. And beyond that fact, Bucky was alive. Then where was he? Why hadn't he looked for Steve? How was he alive? Why did everything in his life have to be so impossible? If in fact, Bucky had survived the fall, he would be elderly. 96 to be exact. He couldn't be alive? Seeing Bucky, old and crippled? No, he couldn't do that. He wouldn't survive that. Not the strong Sergeant Bucky Barnes, withering to nothing in a hospital bed? No, Peggy had been bad enough. He couldn't take that, not from Bucky. It was a kind of agony, knowing Bucky was alive, but being unable to see nor find him. Knowing that logically, the moment Bucky heard that Steve was alive he would find him. It meant that Bucky was unable to get to him. It meant that something was keeping Bucky from him. It meant something real bad had happened. And what their future selves had been talking about Bucky doing something bad. Well, being accused of doing something bad, that is. It meant Bucky still had to be young, but how was that possible, unless... And if that wasn't bad enough, the screen had then gone on to show Peggy. His beautiful, kind, wonderful love, withered in a bed, from old age. Never to furiously command the soldiers around, never to speak with such fire and passion in her voice again. Then, as Steve battled the shock and terror and pain of these scenes, the lethal assassin sitting next to him had, well, tried to comfort him, and it had worked. Beyond the shock of the deadly man trying to help Steve, there was the shock of how familiar the assassin's hands had felt. Even the assassin had moved his hands up and down Steve's arm, and then his neck, had been hauntingly familiar. So familiar. But Steve refused to remember from where, it would only hurt him more. The man had barely said a word throughout the whole viewing, except to warn them of Hydra and snarky replies to Tony's jabs. And every time he did say something, Steve noticed that the assassin's eyes always flickered to him. The fear he always saw in the assassin's eyes was what always got to him. It was like he thought Steve was going to hurt him. Or something. It was unnerving, and tragic. Steve assumed there was more to the assassin's story than what met the eye. Steve was ripped from his thoughts by the movie. Fury is alone in his office, to his voice-controlled computer. Nick Fury. Secure office. All the windows are blackened. Fury takes out the flash drive Natasha had downloaded all the files from the Lemurian Star and places it in his computer. Nick Fury. Open Lemurian Star's satellite launch file. Shield computer. Access denied. Nick Fury. Run decryption. Shield computer. Decryption failed. Nick Fury. Director override. Fury, Nicholas J. Shield computer. Override denied. All files sealed. Nick Fury. On whose authority? Shield computer. Fury, Nicholas J. Steve's eyes narrowed at that. He assumed it must have been Hydra. He thought about asking the assassin, but thought better of it. The metal-armed man seemed to be very tight-lipped about the whole subject. Steve had a feeling that the tight-lipped Ed Ness wasn't completely of the other man's choice. Fury looks confused and worried. Fury enters elevator. Nick Fury. World Security Council. Shield computer. Confirmed. Alexander Pierce is holding a virtual meeting with the World Security Council. At that, Steve's attention was jerked to the assassin sitting next to him, who had paled, and was shaking so hard that his chair was trembling. Steve was at a loss of what to do. Should he try to? Aware of his team's eyes glued to him, He cautiously reached out with a hand towards the Winter Soldier, making sure to keep his palm up, so that the other man could see there was nothing in it. He met the assassin's icy stare, seeing only caution and fear in the other man's eyes. He settled his hand on the assassin's shoulder, copying what the assassin had done to him earlier, rubbing his hand up and down the man's human arm. Steve decided not to go near the guy's neck, just to be safe. The assassin was as tense as humanly possible, before slowly relaxing and sinking back into his chair and closer to Steve. Steve looked away from the assassin for a moment to see Natasha's shocked face, meeting her green eyes steadily. Councilman Rockwell. If Nick Fury thinks he can get his costumed thugs and strike commandos to mop up his mess, he's sadly mistaken. This failure is unacceptable. Councilman Sane. Well, considering this attack took place 1 mile from my country's sovereign waters, it's a bit more than that. I move for immediate hearing. Councilwoman Holly. We don't need hearings, we need action. It's this council's duty to oversee S.H.I.E.L.D. Councilman Yen. A breach like this raises serious questions. It does, it really does. Natasha grumbled in agreement, earning a confused look from Tony. What? Natasha said, catching the look. Thought you knew everything. Regarding S.H.I.E.L.D. and the pirate, Tony said, smirking when he said his nickname for Fury. Steve wasn't really paying attention though. It was odd that the pirates had come so close. Once again, Steve wanted to ask the assassin if he knew anything about it, but once again, pushed the thought away. For one, the assassin, as earlier mentioned, didn't seem to be able to say anything. 2, he was in no condition to talk at the moment, still shaking. Steve glanced over at the assassin, who still looked icy pale, a drop of sweat falling down his forehead. Whatever had startled the assassin, and frightened him, must be bad. Steve had a feeling it was Pierce. Though, why the assassin would be scared of Pierce, he had no clue. The reaction to Pierce had been so much more intense than the one to Rumlow had been. As the shaking continued, Steve carefully rubbed the man's arm, moving onto his back. He hoped it was calming, but he honestly had no clue if it was. Councilman Rockwell. Like how the hell did a French pirate manage to hijack a covert S.H.I.E.L.D. vessel in broad daylight? Alexander Pierce. For the record, Councilman, he's Algerian. I can draw a map if it'll help. Steve felt the assassin flinch at that voice. Steve applied more strength into his effort at calming the man. Honestly, the blonde had no clue what he was doing. Sure, he'd done this before, but only for, well, Bucky. He quickly shoved away the thought of his not-so-dead best friend. He found his hands following a path with their own mind. It was such a familiar movement, obviously. His hands must remember doing it before. Steve almost snickered at that absurd thought. Councilman Rockwell. I appreciate your wit, Secretary Pierce. But this council takes things like international piracy fairly seriously. Alexander Pierce. Really, I don't care about one boat. I care about the fleet. If this council is going to fall a rancor every time someone pushes us on the playing field, maybe we need someone to oversee us. Ooh. Tony said with a smirk, Clint snickering along with the billionaire. Bruce just shook his head at the 2 immature Avengers. Natasha rolled her eyes at her 2 fellow Avengers. Meanwhile, Steve was aware that the only thing that was keeping the assassin calm was whatever comfort Steve was offering him, which couldn't been. Mr. Secretary, nobody is suggesting. They are interrupted by Pierce's assistant walking in and whispering something to Pierce, to the council. Alexander Pierce. Excuse me, Councilman Rockwell, more trouble, Mr. Secretary? Alexander Pierce. It depends on your definition. The meeting ends as Pierce leaves. Alexander Pierce. I work 40 floors away and it takes a hijacking for you to visit? The assassin shivered at the voice, once again shaking. Steve wished he could offer more comfort, but he could hardly give an assassin he barely knew a full-on massage. Quite honestly, he felt like he should recognize the assassin, but he couldn't think from where, and he couldn't recognize the other man when he had the muzzle thing on. If this was any other assassin, he probably wouldn't have tried to comfort him. But the assassin had done it for him. He owed it to the metal-armed man to try. Also, he knew he had met the assassin before. Nick Fury. A nuclear war would do it too. Most of the Avengers huffed in amusement at that line. They shake hands, referring to Pierce's meeting with the World Security Council. Nick Fury. Busy in there? Alexander Pierce. Nothing some earmarks can't fix. Not what it sounded like, Tony said with a shake of his head. We wouldn't be watching this if he just got Fury fired or something, Natasha said with a shrug. Steve assumed it was because that wouldn't be a very good plot. T is the future, not a movie, Nat, he pointed out, without looking at the redhead, his attention still on keeping the assassin calm. Without thinking about it, he smoothed his hand up the back of the assassin's neck. He didn't even realize what he'd done until he felt the assassin tense up for a moment, before relaxing. Realizing what he'd done, Steve knew he was lucky the assassin hadn't snapped at that. A trained killer would never let someone touch his neck, Steve knew this, so really, Steve was lucky that the assassin hadn't injured him. He once again caught Natasha's wide-started eyes. Nick Fury. I'm, here to ask a favor. I want you to call for a vote. Project Insight has to be delayed. Steve could have sworn he heard the assassin mutter, please stall it, under his breath. Thinking back on it, this assassin seemed to know a lot about Hydra. Was he Hydra? But that didn't make sense. Why would he betray them if he served them? Unless he was a double agent? But Steve doubted that. From what Natasha had briefly told the Avengers of the Winter Soldier a few days ago, he was supposed to be a deadly, cold-hearted, monstrous killer. Not the quiet, scared and apparently kind man that was sitting next to Steve. It didn't make sense, unless Steve was right, and the man did none of that of his own free will. Which he was willing to bet on, after all, the assassin had agreed to Tony's Manchurian Candidate comment. And if what Natasha had said about who and what the Manchurian Candidate was, it would make sense. Alexander Pierce. Nick, that's not a favor, that's a subcommittee hearing. A long one. Nick Fury. It could be nothing, probably is nothing, I just need time to make sure it's nothing. Alexander Pierce. What if it's something? Nick Fury. Then we'll both be damn glad those helicarriers aren't in the air. No judging by the assassin's reaction, and it always being linked to Hydra somehow, Steve was pretty sure that Pierce was Hydra. It would fit in perfectly. Glancing over towards the pale assassin, Steve was willing to bet that whatever Hydra had done to make the icy blue-eyed man serve them must be bad. Maybe they had a child of his? A sister? Wife or mother? Possibly a father or brother? A best friend? Using family and friends as threats towards someone normally worked. Pierce hesitates a moment before replying. Alexander Pierce. Fine. But you gotta get Iron Man to stop by my niece's birthday party. The Avengers had to laugh at that one, smirking at the sputtering Tony. What? No, Iron Man, or, the Tin Can, exclaimed in indignation. Nick shakes his hand. No, I hate kids. They're sticky, and whiny and gross. The billionaire continued to complain, looking horrified. Hey, both Clint and Natasha exclaimed at the same time, before blushing at the confused looks they got from the rest of their team. Nick Fury. Thank you, sir. Alexander Pierce. And not just a flyby, he's got to mingle. I'm going to be having a serious discussion with Fury about this. I'm not a party trick, Tony grumbled, earning snickers from his fellow Avengers. Steve looked over towards the assassin, whose eyes looked somewhat amused at the situation. But the eyes still held terror, pain and humiliation mixed in with a small spark of amusement. Pierce turns and leaves. Even though the scene was over, Steve kept on absent-mindedly rubbing the assassin's back. Steve goes to a PTSD group meeting where Sam is counseling other veterans. Ooh, it's that Sam guy again, Tony exclaimed happily, his child phobia forgotten as he stared at the screen. Female war veteran. The thing is I think it's getting worse. A cop pulled me over last week, he thought I was drunk. I swerved to miss a plastic bag. I thought it was an IED. Steve winced a little at that. He knew what it felt like to see something and be yanked back to the old days, back when he'd fought that war against Hydra. He still couldn't look at trains without. No, he shoved that thought away, it was too painful. Sam Wilson. Some stuff you leave there, other stuff you bring back. It's our job to figure out how to carry it. Is it gonna be in a big suitcase or in a little man purse? It's up to you. After the meeting ends, Steve waits for Sam as he finishes saying goodbye to the veterans. Female war veteran. I'll see you next week, Sam Wilson, yeah. Female war veteran. Yeah. Sam walks over to Steve. Sam Wilson. Look who it is. The running man, Capsicle. He meant Capsicle, Tony said, helpfully. Steve felt the assassin shift under his hand. Capsicle? The assassin asked in a quiet, tired voice, earning a surprised look from Tony. Don't you know? Seeing the look on the assassin's face, Tony huffed. Of course you don't. Dear, Captain Spangles here spent around 70 years as a living popsicle. This only served to make the assassin look more confused. Steve rolled his eyes. Don't listen to him, the blonde grumbled, before explaining what Tony had meant. I was frozen in ice for around 70 years after World War II, he explained to the assassin. The assassin looked surprised, but nodded his head. Steve Rogers. Caught the last few minutes, it's pretty intense. Sam Wilson. Yeah, brother, we all got the same problems. Guilt, regret. Steve Rogers. You lose someone? Sam Wilson. My wingman, Riley. Flying a night mission. Standard PJ rescue op. Nothing we hadn't done 1,000 times before, till RPG knocked Riley's dumb ass out of the sky. Nothing I could do. It's like I was up there just to watch. Steve shivered. He knew what it was like to watch someone fall. There was nothing worse than that feeling of helplessness as you watched a brother fall, being unable to grab him. Unable to save him. All you could do is watch as they fell, never to see them again. Knowing that nothing you can ever do can save them. Seeing that look of terror. Steve yanked himself from that train of thoughts. He couldn't break down again. He couldn't. Not when his team was watching. He was supposed to be Captain America, strong, bold and not scared of anything. Not a whimpering, depressed man who'd had everything taken away from him. Steve Rogers. I'm sorry. Sam Wilson. After that, I had a really hard time finding a reason for being over there, you know? He did. He knew very well. After Bucky fell, he was ready to give up. Because what was the point of fighting when you'd already lost? The only thing that had let him carry on was Peggy's urging, and the fact that he could save lives. That way nobody else would have to lose their Bucky, their brother. But if that hadn't been the case, well, the CA remembered differently. He wouldn't have carried on, except he had to. That was one of the reasons he'd been able to crash that plane. Knowing that he'd return home without Bucky. Knowing he'd never find a best friend like him again. Well, it made committing self-sacrifice a lot easier than it should have been. Steve Rogers. But you're happy now, back in the world? Sam Wilson. Hey, the number of people giving me orders is down to about 0. So, hell, yeah. You thinking about getting out? Steve Rogers. No, I don't know. To be honest, I don't know what I would do with myself if I did. Sam Wilson. Ultimate fighting? Steve laughs. It's just a great idea off the top of my head. But seriously, you could do whatever you want to do. What makes you happy? Steve Rogers. I don't know. Steve could practically see Tony biting back a sarcastic comment. Steve rolled his eyes. He'd gotten used to being unhappy. At least now, Bucky was apparently alive. Steve wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Obviously he wanted Bucky to be alive, but at the same time, what had kept Bucky from finding him? Okay, I'm not sure if I'll be able to keep up the 2 chapters a day thing. It's very tiring. But I'll try. Sorry if the dialogue in these rambles on a little. I intend to make a following fanfic to this. A Bucky recovering one. And possibly make these dear characters watch the other 2 Captain America movies. And now, on to causing more emotional trauma for our dear Bucky. Our dear Bucky. PaleWolfsHowl. P.S. Do you guys have any idea how hard it is to type, maybe Archer Clint, over and over again? It's awful. The acid was still freaked out about the boss being at S.H.I.E.L.D. He couldn't help it. The moment that face had come onto the screen, he had freaked. Yes, Rumlow was worse. But it was Pierce who controlled the acid. It was him that decreed that the acid should be frozen or sit in the chair. It was him who let Rumlow do as he pleased with the acid. It was him who would make the acid hurt the captain. And that was the worst part. Worse than looking at the man and feeling the phantom of electricity coursing through him. Worse than the remembrance of the whips coming down on him. The thought of the boss being in the same building as Steve. Knowing that, in time, he would send the acid after Steve. And the acid would have no say in it. He would attack the captain. He could only hope that Steve was able to kill him. The captain kid and had to win. As long as the mask stayed on the asset's face, the captain wouldn't recognize him. The asset, now knowing this was to happen in the future, had made up his mind. He couldn't go back to Hydra. Ever. And since he could never escape Hydra, he would do the only thing he could do. As soon as this movie was over, he'd kill himself. He didn't care how he did it, or what happened during the movie. He had to protect the captain. Even if he died for it, he would die for the captain, as he should have all those years ago. He had almost cried out in shock when Steve had first reached his hand out towards the asset. He had been expecting to be slapped across the face, but instead, the captain had tried to comfort him. Just like the asset had tried to comfort the captain earlier. But it was different. The asset was a tool. Why would someone try to help a tool? It had been such a shock when the captain gently began rubbing his arm and back. It was so different from how he'd been treated for the last 70-something years. Such a shock that the asset had almost choked. It was one thing for him to try and help Steve. That's what a good asset did, but for someone to try and help an asset? Then, he'd nearly jumped out of his skin when the gentle hand rubbed the back of his neck. He would have snapped if it had been anyone but the captain. Too many memories of harsh, cold hands grabbing his by the back of the neck. But, surprisingly, the touch had been comforting. And even when the scene with Pierce had ended, the captain had kept his hand on the asset's neck. The asset's attention was snapped to the screen as noises started to come from it again. As Fury drives through the city, he instructs his car computer to make a call. Fury's car. Activating communications encryption protocol. Nick Fury. Open secure line 0405. Fury's car. Confirmed. Maria Hill. This is Hill. Nick Fury. I need you here in DC Deep Shadow conditions. The asset fought the urge to say, that's an awful code name, afraid that if he spoke, Steve would realize he hadn't moved his hand and take it away. Or worse, Steve would realize he'd been comforting an asset and be angry at the asset. Maria Hill. Give me 4 hours. Nick Fury. You have 3, over. The asset had been so lost in his thoughts that he almost jumped St. Stark's huff on amusement. Fury stops at a red traffic light. He looks over to the next car and sees the 2 police officers in the car look at him with suspicion. Want to see my lease? The policemen quickly sound their police horn once before they start to drive off. As Fury goes to drive off, suddenly another police car smashes into his car. His car is then surrounded by several other police cars crashing into him. Inside his car, Fury is injured. Oh dear. Natasha muttered, glancing over at the asset and the captain. The asset felt Steve's hand tense on his shoulder as Eyepatch's car crashed into another car. At the looks of intense worry on everyone's faces, the asset spoke. This doesn't have to happen. Change it. He said quietly, knowing they'd understand his message. The asset wasn't used to talking much, so his English was limited. Even when he spoke, it was normally in Russian. Steve's hand untensed and started rubbing the asset's shoulders again. Manchurian Candidate's got a point, Stark said, looking grateful for the asset's comment. Really, the room lightened up at the Winter Soldier's point. Yeah, thanks Winter. Maybe Archer, Clint said, huffing and leaning backwards in his seat. The asset didn't want to speak again, but Winter, why had maybe Archer Clint called him that? He'd never been called Winter in his life, or maybe he had? It's not like he'd know. But the asset didn't want to speak imprudently. He didn't want the captain to disapprove of him. It turned out he didn't have to, for Natasha raised an eyebrow at her fellow agent. Clint? She asked with a raised eyebrow. He's the Winter Soldier. Therefore Winter. It's rude to keep calling him Manchurian Candidate. Maybe Archer, Clint said, like his reasoning was obvious. Fury's car. Fracture detected. Recommend anesthetic injection. As Fury is giving himself the injection, a SWAT team truck pulls up. DC Metro Police dispatch shows no units in this area. Fury is surrounded by the police and SWAT team. He quickly realizes they're all disguised mercenaries, to his car computer. Hydra. The word seemed to explode in the asset's mind. Hydra, Hydra, Hydra. It was so obviously Hydra's doing. The asset just prayed they didn't drag him into this. Nick Fury. Get me out of here. The mercenaries suddenly start shooting at Fury's car. Fury's car. Propulsion systems offline. Nick Fury. Then reboot, damn it. The armor on Fury's vehicle starts to become weaker. The mercenaries bring out a battering ram to break in. Fury's car. Warning, window integrity compromised. I would imagine so, grumbled Stark as he watched the screen, earning a huff of a laugh from Clint. The Acid had to agree with Stark. Or was he Winter now? He didn't want to reclaim his former name, it didn't belong to him. And he was still an Acid. But why not be Winter until Hydra took him back? Nick Fury. You think, how long to propulsion? Fury's car. Calculating. The mercenaries start to use the battering ram on Fury's car window. Window integrity 31%. Deploying countermeasures. Nick Fury. Hold that order. The battering ram is smashed against the car window again. Fury's car. Window integrity 19%. Offensive measures advised. Nick Fury. Wait, the battering ram is smashed against the window again. Fury's car. Window integrity 1%. Nick Fury. Now, suddenly a minigun pulls up from inside the car and Fury uses it to return fire on the mercenaries, causing the SWAT truck and some of the police cars to explode. "Yah! Go Fury!" Stark exclaimed, throwing his fist into the air. The Acid Winter couldn't help but flinch at the flying fist. Steve seemed to notice and he gripped the Acid Winter's shoulder tighter. Fury's car. Propulsion systems now online. Nick Fury. Full acceleration. Now, as he continues to fire at the mercenaries, Fury's car automatically backs up and drives off. Initiate vertical takeoff. Fury's car. Flight systems damaged. Nick Fury. Then activate guidance cameras. Fury goes over into the driver's seat. Give me the wheel. Fury takes over driving his car as the mercenaries chase after him in their police cars. Get me Agent Hill. Fury's car. Communications array damaged. Nick Fury. Well, what's not damaged? Fury's car. Air conditioning is fully operational. Even though the scene was highly stressful, everyone burst out laughworthy as Winter. But even the Winter had to smirk at the line, appreciating the car's sense of humor. Wait, since when did cars have a sense of humor, or talk for that matter? The police cars continue to chase after Fury as he weaves through the cars on the road, traffic ahead. Nick Fury. Give me an alternate route. Fury's car. Traffic alert on Roosevelt Bridge. All vehicles stopped. 17th Avenue clear in 3 blocks, directly ahead. As Fury heads into the traffic, he smashes into some cars, causing a pileup which stops the police cars. The mercenaries get out and start shooting at Fury's car. Fury manages to kill 2 of the mercenaries by running them down before getting past the traffic. But the remaining mercenaries continue to chase after him and manage to sandwich Fury's vehicle between them. Warning, approaching intersection. As they approach the intersection, Fury manages to shake off the 2 police cars, killing off the mercenaries. Yeesh, pirate's kinda scary when he wants to be. Stark huffed in stressed amusement. Hey, you could say that. Snickered maybe Archer Clint, looking like he was remembering something. Nick Fury. Get me off the grid. Fury's car. Calculating route to secure location. Fury sees a mysterious figure. Winter felt himself grow cold. No, please, no, but he wasn't stupid. He knew the figure was him. Winter tucked himself as far back in his seat as he could get, and though he didn't want to, further away from the captain. He didn't deserve the other man's comfort. He could feel the blonde's blue eyes burning into him. Winter turned to meet the captain's eyes. And to his shock, there was understanding in Steve's eyes. He could practically read what the captain was thinking. You don't have a choice, do you? Steve's eyes said, as he stared intently at Winter. Winter blinked before shaking his head a little, a clear, no, I don't. He didn't know how, or why, this kind of communication was so easy for him and the captain to do. It felt familiar, he'd assume he must have done so before. And if he had done it before, it would make sense that it would have been with Steve. Since, apparently they were best friends since childhood, though, Winter doubted that that counted anymore. It had been hydrated out of him. Winter noticed that the rest of the humans were staring at him. Steve followed his eyes. And Winter assumed the other man must have glared at because they looked away quickly. Emerge ahead, which suddenly shoots a bomb that attaches itself to Fury's vehicle, causing it to explode and flip over. Trapped inside his car, Fury watches as the figure walks over to the car, but he manages to escape just in time by using a laser weapon to burn a hole out. Winter winced. curling in on himself. Why did it always have to be him? Why did Hydra have to choose him? Why not anyone else? Why did he have to be the Winter Soldier? The fist of Hydra. Why couldn't Hydra have just left him alone? The rebellious thoughts caused a flashback to flash into his mind, pulling him into its intensity. He was strapped into a chair, the chair, in the flashback. Someone was speaking, it was a voice he should know. "We chose you because you mean the most to Captain America, besides that puny woman. He won't be able to fight. And the serum has taken a hold on you, Barnes. You will be the fist of Hydra. You will do as we say, Sergeant. You are nothing more than a tool. And you're not getting out of that chair until you say Hail Hydra." The voice said coldly, soullessly. Then, in the flashback, Winter screamed. Thankfully, he wasn't making any noise outside of what was going on in his mind. In the flashback, the chair's electricity thundered and burned through him. The remembered pain was duller than the chair was in real life, but still awful. The chair stopped. The voice spoke again. "Say it, Acid. Say it." The snake-like voice burst through Winter's head. Then, Winter's past self spoke. "Never." Winter's former self's voice was ragged in his memory. "This is not the 107th. No Captain America can save you now," the voice said, sounding pleased. Then, the flashback ended, leaving a shaking Winter. He was aware of Steve's hands strongly clamped on his shoulder. He must have been moving while he was trapped in the flashback. "Winter?" the captain asked quietly, unsurety in his voice. Winter blinked into focus, meeting the captain's worried eyes, which were closer than Winter had expected. "Captain." He managed to rasp out, his voice ragged, like his flashback self's voice had been. Relief shone in Steve's clear blue eyes. Whatever the 107th was, Winter thought the voice had been wrong. The captain had saved him. Even though he would be lost to Hydra's grasp again, the captain had saved him for this short time, and that was enough. Winter knew he didn't deserve it. Not after what he'd done. The voice had been right in that way. Winter would forever be Hydra's fist. And that was why he'd kill himself before he left to go back to Hydra. His mind was forever Hydra's. But this small part of him belonged to him, and only him. He wouldn't let Hydra take it away, not again. Winter looked over at Steve again, meeting his gaze. "Sorry," he said simply, nodding towards the screen. The captain just nodded, silently saying, "It's okay." Winter was very aware of Natasha's eyes burning into him as Steve held out a hand, palm up, an offering. Winter eyed it for a moment, before reaching out with his flesh hand and shaking the captain's hand firmly. An agreement. That the captain wouldn't judge Winter for anything he did in the movie. It was also an offer of, friendship? Winter had no clue why the captain would offer forgiveness so easily, especially to an Acid. Winter was just a tool. You didn't keep a broken, rusted tool around for the fun of it. They kept their hands locked for a couple long seconds before both letting go. Though both super soldiers leaned more towards each other than they had been before. As Steve is walking to his apartment, he hears his pretty neighbor talking on the phone as she goes to do her laundry. "Who's that?" asks Stark noisily, turning to stare at the captain hard. Winter didn't hear Steve's reply, lost in his own mind. The moment Stark had turned that hard stare at the captain, Winter had felt like it was a threat. Rage shimmering in him at the idea, before he got a hang on himself. He didn't understand his reaction. Why would he care if Stark looked at Steve hardly? He'd never felt protective of someone like that before. At least not while at Hydra. No, he had. For his third handler, she had been so much kinder than all the rest of them. Taking pity on the Acid and not harming him unless necessary. She had been killed for her softness. Winter could remember his rage as he had watched her be beheaded. He remembered how back when she was alive, he had almost attacked anyone who so much as looked at her wrong. She had been a proper handler, strict, not allowing disobedience or disloyalty. She hadn't punished him much, but she'd made sure he knew his place, and when she had punished him, it had been bad. But she had only punished him when he seriously messed up. Like failed a very important mission. She always explained why she had punished him afterwards, in a soft, stern voice. As the days had gone on, she had become softer and softer on the Acid. Until, one day, she accidentally let it show. And it had cost her her life. Winter had a guess on why he had felt the same towards Steve. His messed up mind was starting to see the captain as his handler. He assumed it was a mix of Hydra's programming, and the fact that he had once known Steve. He knew he'd already follow any order the blonde gave him. The only thing that really worried him was that he might accidentally reveal this fact to the captain. And that would be a disaster. Sharon Carter. That's so sweet. That is so nice. Hey, I gotta go, though. Okay, bye. Turning to Steve. My aunt, she's kind of an insomniac. Steve smiles at her. Yeah. Steve Rogers. Hey, if you want. Welcome to use my machine. Might be cheaper than the one in the basement. Ooh, does somebody have a crush? Maybe Archer Clint said with a smirk towards the captain, who glared at him. Stark snickered. Winter managed to stop himself from analyzing ways to easily kill maybe Archer Clint. He really needed to get control over that. Sharon Carter. Oh, yeah? What's it cost? Steve Rogers. A cup of coffee? Sharon Carter. Thank you, but I already have a load in downstairs, and, you really don't want my scrubs in your machine. I'm just finished orientation in the infectious diseases ward, so. Steve Rogers. Well, I'll keep my distance. Sharon Carter. Well, hopefully not too far. Steve nods and turns to go into his apartment. Oh, and I think you left your stereo on. Steve Rogers. Oh. Right, thank you. Sharon Carter. Yeah. Steve watches her go down the stairs before turning in suspicion to his door. Steve hears music as he cautiously enters his apartment through the window. Great. Someone broke into my home. Lovely. Steve grumbled, glaring at the screen. The other humans broke into laughter while Winter raised an eyebrow. What was funny about someone breaking into Steve's house? Winter just hoped it wasn't him, but he doubted he would play music. He grabs his shield for protection and finds Fury sitting on his couch in the dark. Winter almost gasped in relief. Even though he'd logically known it wasn't him in Steve's home, he had still worried. Steve Rogers. I don't remember giving you a key. Nick Fury. You really think I'd need one? My wife kicked me out. Fury's married? Stark said with disbelief and confusion radiating from his voice. No, he doesn't. Natasha said with a smirk. Yeah, nobody can hide a family. Maybe Archer Clint said with a smirk, before exchanging a look with the redhead. Winter could tell they were hiding something. Steve Rogers. Didn't know you were married. Nick Fury. A lot of things you don't about me. Steve Rogers. I know, Nick. That's the problem. Fury wouldn't be Fury if he didn't have secrets. Natasha pointed out, earning a huff from Steve. Yeah, the pirates' secrets have secrets. Stark said, earning a glare from the captain. Winter tilted his head a little, wondering what backstory there was to that. As Steve turns on the light, he notices Fury's injuries for the first time. Winter flinched, knowing he was the cause behind half of those. The captain seemed to notice the asset's discomfort and stress, for he reached over and gently rubbed Winter's shoulder, making the asset relax. But Fury indicates for him to be silent. He turns off the light and writes something on his phone and shows it to Steve, ears everywhere. Nick Fury. I'm sorry to have to do this, but I had no place else to crash. He writes another text and shows it to Steve, shield compromised. At least he knows. It would be worse if Eyepatch Fury knew about Hydra. He seemed to be a dangerous man. A good enemy for Hydra to have. Steve Rogers. Who else knows about your wife? Fury shows him another text. You and me. Nick Fury. Just, my friends. Steve Rogers. Is that what we are? Nick Fury. That's up to you. Suddenly Fury is shot 3 times from through the wall and collapses. A collective gasp went up in the room, and Winter's hand flew to his face so he could pinch the bridge of his nose. Gosh darn it, of course Hydra wouldn't let him get away with failure. He'd probably been firmly punished for letting Eyepatch get away the first time. He wouldn't fail again. Winter knew that. Steve turned to look at him, and Winter gave a small nod. Yes, it was him. Steve looks out the window for the shooter, then he quickly drags Fury to the next room. Before he leaves, Fury hands him the flash drive. Don't trust anyone. Fury passes out. Steve hears someone breaking into his apartment and hears his neighbor calling out to him. Sharon Carter. Captain Rogers. Steve sees her walking in with her gun pointed. Captain, I'm Agent 13 of SHIELD Special Service. Really can't trust anybody, Steve muttered, glaring at the screen. Steve Rogers. Kate, Sharon Carter. I'm assigned to protect you. Steve Rogers. On whose order? She notices Fury lying injured on the ground. Sharon Carter. His. She goes to Fury, then contacts S.H.I.E.L.D. through her radio. Foxtrot is down. He's unresponsive. I need EMTs. Foxtrot? Maybe Archer, Clint said with a raised eyebrow. Winter almost smirked at that. Almost. It was a silly codename, after all. Nobody would think it was Fury. Natasha pointed out with a shrug. S.H.I.E.L.D. agent. Do you have a 20 on the shooter? Steve notices the shooter through the window. Steve Rogers. Tell him I'm in pursuit. Steve smashes through his window and runs after the assassin, who is the same mysterious man that had exploded Fury's car. Steve chases him through an office building, smashing through the walls. When he finally catches up with him on the roof, he throws his shield at the assassin, but he catches it with one swift move, then throws it back to Steve and then jumps down the building and disappears. There was a moment of silence before Stark turned to look at Winter. Okay, Manchurian Candidate, time's up. What's going on? The man said forcefully. Winter looked at him for a long moment before sighing. He knew this was coming. Yes, please explain, Winter Soldier. Natasha said, looking at him with narrowed green eyes. Once again, Winter remembered shooting someone through her. Steve's hand tensed on Winter's shoulder. Fine, Winter said, testing out his ragged, unused voice. But it's a long story. Okay, I got the weirdest, most hilarious review earlier. To clear this up, I am not a blonde. The girl in this story is an OC. Lol. I'm a brunette. Oh dear. I needed that, thanks Super Shadow 2018. Also, thanks for the reviews and the idea on how to do Age of Ultron with my obsession with Clint and Natasha. Also, of course I'll read your story, smiley face. PaleWolfsHowl. P.S. I unfortunately had to take down my original FIC with the Avengers watching the Winter Soldier. Since it didn't have a plot, I was attacked by a feral admin. Oof. PSS. I'm not even going to reply to that last part of your first review, Super Shadow, _. Steve tilted his head a little, anticipating the assassin's, or Winter's, story. Though, he was fairly tense, considering the looks his fellow Avengers were sending Winter. Steve assumed that this odd connection he had with Winter had something to do with how similar the man was to Bucky. Obviously, there were a lot of differences, like how Bucky wasn't an assassin or mind-washed. But Winter seemed to have a lot of the same gestures, and from the few things he'd said, Steve could tell the man used to have a dry sense of humor. Steve shook his head, clearing it of thoughts of Bucky, which was hard and nearly impossible. He turned his attention back to Winter. Steve could tell that Winter was nervous, his pale blue eyes looking wary and tense. Steve also noticed that Winter's metal fist was clenched hard. The assassin trailed off for a moment, before meeting Natasha's expectant look. I don't remember much about before Hydra got me. I do know that I was American and serving in a war. Winter paused, meeting Steve's astonished look. This Russian assassin was originally American, not to mention serving in a war. Then, something happened to me. I lost my arm, Winter said, rolling his metal shoulder in emphasis while he spoke. Why can't you remember anything? Bruce asked timidly, turning to look at Winter more closely. Steve had been about to ask that. He knew that Winter wasn't in control of his actions, but why couldn't he remember anything? He felt Winter shudder, his shoulders tensing. They Hydra used this chair, on me. Winter trailed off, as if looking for the right words. It wiped my memory, he finally said. Permanently? Steve asked, shooting a concerned look at Winter, who shook his head. No, the longer I'm in here, the more come back. Memories. Hydra normally doesn't let them come back, that is. I'm either on a mission or with the technicians. The soldier's words were choppy. It was obvious he didn't speak much. Why can't you remember? I mean on missions. Why can't you get back memories during missions? Bruce asked, seeming highly interested. Steve felt Winter tremble again. While I'm on missions? Well, Hydra messed up my head big time. I can't not listen to their orders. If they came in here right now, said some pretty words in Russian, I would kill you all. Without thought or feeling. He paused. For Affector to just let what he'd said sink in, Steve didn't know. The code words make my mind go blanker, I guess. I'm brought back into the mindset of the Winter Soldier. And when I'm not on orders, I'm always with them. They don't give me any time to remember before it's back to the chair. Winter said with a haunted look in his icy eyes. Steve shuddered. Whatever this chair did. What does this chair do? Exactly, he couldn't help but ask, curiosity and dread pooling in his stomach. It shocks me with electricity. Burns away memories. They chose what they want to be remembered and what to wipe. Winter said, and Steve could see the horror of it reflected in the assassin's eyes. But you're unconscious, right? Bruce said, and Steve could hear the doubtful hope in the scientist's voice. Knowing Hydra, they would make sure Winter suffered. No, Winter said blankly. They might have. If I had complied sooner. At the Avengers' confused looks, Winter sighed. I didn't want to serve Hydra. I know that. They make sure I remember pain. They generally enjoy causing it. They like to keep me on a tight leash. I can see why. Whoever I was back before. Hydra, well, I was apparently a very rebellious person. As you can see, without Hydra here to silence me, I'm generally prone to traitor-like acts. Winter said tiredly. He then smirked a little. Stark was pretty accurate with his nickname for me. Tony huffed at that. Steve couldn't imagine how awful Winter's life must have been. Living in Hydra's evil clutches for as long as he could remember. Never to be free, always chained down by the crimes he'd been forced to commit. The pain Hydra must just love to inflict. And from Winter's reaction to Rumlow and Pierce, Steve guessed that the assassin's life was a lot worse than he was making it seem. Steve watched as Winter, having said all he felt he needed to, turned back to the screen. You didn't need to be a genius to see that the assassin was done talking. Glancing over at his friends, Steve saw that they looked satisfied with what Winter had told them, though they also looked disturbed. Steve could guess why. Steve felt Winter shift under his hand, and with great embarrassment, realized he hadn't yet removed his hand. Though when he went to move his hand away, Winter immediately tensed. Steve's brow furrowed in confusion. Did the assassin want him to keep his hand where it was? Natasha goes to the hospital and meets up with Steve. They watch doctors operating on Fury. Most of the Avengers sucked in their breath at how beat up Fury looked, bruised and beaten. Steve rubbed Winter's shoulders as the assassin tensed at the sight of his handiwork. Natasha Romanoff. Is he gonna make it? Steve Rogers. I don't know. Natasha Romanoff. Tell me about the shooter. That's when, to Steve's confusion, Winter spoke to Natasha, though not in English. No tai Yuji Nal, Natok Lee, Vidova? But you already knew, didn't you, widow? Winter said, though Steve had no clue what it meant. Was he speaking in Russian? Natasha, to Steve's surprise, smirked and replied. Skorai Viesigo, you menya bilo Pridchevstiva, soldat. I most likely had a hunch, soldier. Winter seemed satisfied by that, but Tony certainly wasn't. Okay, what are you saying? Honestly, not all of us can't speak assassin. Tony exclaimed, throwing his hands up into the air. Ito Ruski, a nay assassin. Somnaviases, chto ito yazik. Konservnaya banka. It's Russian, not assassin. I doubt that's a language. Tin can. Winter said cheerfully. Even though it was frustrating that he couldn't understand a word they were saying, Steve was just glad that Winter was showing an emotion besides fear or distrust. Da, Tony, ya dolzin soglazidsia s soldatum. Assassin, ito ne yazik, ito still, Zhizhin. Ya, Tony. I have to agree with the soldier. Assassin isn't a language, it is a lifestyle. Natasha said, sounding excited to have someone to talk Russian with. Tony once again threw his hands up into the air, letting out a groan of frustration. Steve just shook his head at his teammates and the assassin. Ito talk, Vidova, Ito talk. That it is, widow, that it is, Winter said, nodding his head. Steve rolled his eyes, still having no clue what the two were saying, and turned back to the screen. Steve Rogers. He's fast and strong. Had a metal arm. Just then Agent Maria Hill also joins them. Natasha Romanoff. Ballistics, Maria Hill. 3 slugs, no rifling. Completely untraceable. Natasha Romanoff. Soviet-made. Maria Hill. Yeah. Suddenly they watch in shock as Fury's state deteriorates. Male nurse. He's in VTAC. Female nurse. Crash cart coming in. Doctor. Nurse, help me with the drape. Male nurse. BP is dropping. Doctor. Defibrillator. Steve, Natasha and Hill watch in shock as Fury is flatlining. I want you to charge him at 100. Natasha Romanoff. Don't do this to me, Nick. Steve could practically feel tension and guilt coming from Winter, who had his head in his hands. He knew that nothing he could say would help, so he just offered. Hopefully just being beside Winter and rubbing his back would be enough. Steve looked over at Natasha, who had gripped Clint's arm in an iron-tight grasp. Steve knew how close Natasha was to Fury. He also knew that Natasha hated showing so much emotion, being so vulnerable. Doctor. Stand back. 3, 2, 1. Clear. Fury is given a shock with the defibrillator. Pulse. Male nurse. No pulse. Doctor number 1. No pulse. Doctor. Okay. 200. Please. Stand back. 3, 2, 1. Clear. Fury is given another shock. Give me epinephrine. Pulse. Male nurse. Negative. Natasha Romanoff. Don't do this to me, Nick. Don't do this to me. The three watch the doctors as they continue to revive Fury, but Fury is still showing his flatlining. Steve turns away as they finally call his time of death. Steve could feel the assassin's pain as if it was his own. With every painful drawled-out breath Winter gave, Steve felt the ache in his soul. The guilt in the soldier's eyes was breathtaking, for there was so much of it. Doctor. What's the time? Female nurse. 1:03. Doctor. Doctor. Time of death. 1:03 a.m. Steve looks down at the flash drive Fury had given him. Natasha and Steve are in a room where Fury's dead body has been laid out. Natasha is looking at Fury's body with tears running down her face. Hill joins them. Even Tony knew better than to comment. Natasha hated being seen as weak. And it was a subject that no one brought up as a rule. Like how nobody brought up Natasha's childhood or Steve's days before being, as Tony put it, a capsicle. Steve did notice that Clint was hugging Natasha close to his chest, oddly close. Maria Hill. I need to take him. Steve goes over to Natasha. Steve Rogers. Natasha. She doesn't respond. Instead she tenderly touches Fury's head, then turns and walks out. Steve follows her. Natasha. Natasha Romanoff. Why was Fury in your apartment? Classified, Steve said, trying to lighten the mood. It worked, seeing as Natasha huffed a little. Yeah, classified, sure. Tony said playfully, always up for messing around. Very classified, Bruce said, nodding his head. Steve could practically feel Winter's confusion at the Avengers interaction. It's so classified that it's classy, Clint said, making everyone snicker or roll their eyes at the Archer. Extremely classified. Natasha finally joined in. Steve looked to his side, meeting Winter's extremely confused eyes. He nodded a little at the assassin, encouraging him to speak, wondering what he had to say. What is the point of this discussion? You've already established that it is classified. Why do you waste your breath repeating it? When you're all old and gray you will regret this conversation, for it is a waste of time and oxygen, Winter said passionately. And what you just said wasn't, Tony asked gleefully, happy to have something over Winter for once. Steve could practically hear the gears in Winter's head grinding, looking for something to say back. Touché, living toaster. He finally settled on, making Tony gawk at him, and the other Avengers burst into laughter. Steve Rogers. I don't know. They are interrupted by Rumlow. Lies, both Tony and Clint screeched at the same time, making Winter wince. Brock Rumlow. Cap, they want you back at S.H.I.E.L.D. Steve Rogers. Yeah, give me a second. Brock Rumlow. They want you now. Pushy, grumbled Natasha, glaring at her former friend, who had turned out to be Hydra. They always are. Winter said tiredly, making Steve look at him with concern. Steve Rogers. Okay. Steven turns to Natasha. Natasha Romanoff. You're a terrible liar. She turns and walks off. Jasper Sitwell. On earpiece, strike team. Escort Captain Rogers back to S.H.I.E.L.D. immediately for questioning. Hydra, Hydra, everything is Hydra. Tony sang mockingly, earning a glare from both Winter and Natasha, before Winter shrugged. Living toasters got a point, he admitted. Brock Rumlow. I told him. Steve notices the vending machine next to him. We then see Steve walking towards Rumlow. Oh, what great plan has the master chef Captain America cooked up this time? Clint asked, smirking at Steve's dry glare. Steve Rogers. Let's go. Brock Rumlow. Yeah. To the agents. Strike, move it out. As they leave we see that Steve has hid the flash drive behind a pack of gums in the vending machine. Better hope no one buys bubble gum, Captain. Winter pointed out. Steve was a mix of glad and exasperated at Winter's newfound ability to chat up a storm. In a haunting way. Winter's way of phrasing things was familiar, horribly familiar. Well, here it goes, another chapter. Thanks to everyone who has followed, favorited this story. Also, I was obsessed with a story a certain author wrote, and they actually found this story and followed it. Thanks Agent W. You nearly gave me a heart attack. And thanks to a certain guest who gave me a very kind review. Also, to Super Shadow, once again, thanks for the review. I do intend to do things similar to what you commented, thanks. Also sorry for how long this chapter has taken. My dear friend showed me a couple new book series and I'm currently trying to read them all. So thanks for your patience. Also, I have no idea how to write this chap. PaleWolfsHowl. Winter felt odd. Very odd. What was this new feeling? Like a mix of adrenaline and nerves, mixed with an odd bubbly feeling. Okay, that sounded stupid even to him. But he felt lighter somehow, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Though, he was still very aware of the fact that he belonged to Hydra and always would. This was a nice break, but at the same time it was torture. This little bit of time with the Avengers and Steve was like a new kind of torment. Kinda like if you gave a blind man a glimpse of the world only to take it all away again, leaving him in darkness. That's why Winter knew he could never leave this room alive. Not when the risk was losing himself again, whoever he was. And the biggest thing, if this future video was accurate, then Winter could actually harm the captain, or one of the captain's friends. And he could never let that happen. Not only for his own sake, but for the sake of who he once was. He didn't want to drag the memory of Steve's best friend through the mud again. Not after he'd done it so many times. It was an odd agony, being forced to leave life the moment it was starting to look better. It was bittersweet. The fact that Winter would die of his own will, in control of his own actions, was a blessing. He certainly didn't deserve it though, not with all the innocent blood on his hands. The bitter part was that he finally had some time to be himself, only to have it cruelly ripped away by the unfair and cold clutches of the earth. But he knew there was no other way, he'd have to end it. It was the only way. Besides, he didn't deserve life. Not after he had taken so many with his own hands. It didn't matter that he hadn't been in control. It was still his hands on the gun, the knife, the rope. And Winter hated it. He hated being a tool, and being used. And he wouldn't let it happen again. Winter knew that the girl hadn't taken all of his weapons. He still had a gun, hidden in a slot in his arm, where Hydra had put it. He was snapped out of his increasingly morbid thoughts by the movie. Back at S.H.I.E.L.D., Steve is brought to Pierce, who is talking to Agent 13. Alexander Pierce. For whatever it's worth, you did your best. Sharon Carter. Thank you, sir. As she turns to leave she sees Steve, Captain Rogers. Steve replies coldly as he walks towards Pierce. Steve Rogers. Neighbor. Ooh, ouch. That's cold, even for you, Capsicle. Stark said, and Winter assumed he was trying to lighten up the mood. For Steve's face had gone rigid as he watched his neighbor. Winter wanted to offer the captain comfort, but that would be an awkward position, seeing as Steve's hand was already on Winter's back. Also, Winter had overstepped his bounds enough for one day. He'd even been sarcastic, something that, he vaguely remembered, had gotten himself more than one slap. Alexander Pierce. Ah, Captain. I'm Alexander Pierce. Ah, Captain. I'm a lunatic who likes to hear little children scream for their parents, was more accurate. Winter had been commanded to hold down more than one small child as Pierce tortured them. It was never fun. Even when Winter was busy being Mr. Brainwashed, he still hadn't liked it, or been okay with it. Something about the screams had always brought a very maternal protective side out in him. Not that that really mattered in the end. Steve Rogers. Sir, it's an honor. They shake hands. Obviously, you don't know what a honor is. Winter couldn't help but mutter under his breath. But then he instantly felt awful about it. After all, who was he to sass of Captain America? He was just a murderer. He didn't know a thing about honor. Winter was as tense as a bolt. He could feel Steve's sad eyes on him. The Hydra assassin just burrowed back into his chair, letting Steve's hand rest on his shoulder. Alexander Pierce. The honor is mine, Captain. My father served in the 101st, come on in. Winter felt a jolt of panic as the captain followed Pierce into the room. It made him think of all the times he'd been forced to follow the man into a room. Normally by the time he came out, he couldn't remember going in. Now that the memories were coming back, it wasn't only the good ones. With Steve, he was also getting a full blast of Hydra. He remembered things long forgotten, like the time he'd been forced to choose between a piece of bread and shooting a woman. That was very early on, and he could still remember being Bucky Barnes at that point. So at first he had refused. But everyone breaks eventually. He remembered pulling the trigger and watching the woman fall. He remembered watching many breathe their last. He sure knew he'd helped people reach that last breath. He remembered poisoning a little girl's dinner and watching her fall out of her chair, skin as white as snow. He remembered watching the parents scream and cry over their little girl. He remembered being led into a room by a Hydra agent and heated until he broke down and cried. The more memories that came back, the more he hated himself. He was a monster. It didn't matter who he used to be, because he was what he was now. And he pitied the captain, for Steve still had hope for his friend. But even though Bucky Barnes still breathed, he had died many, long cold years ago. They enter Pierce's office where he shows Steve an old photo of Fury with Pierce. That photo was taken 5 years after Nick and I met. When I was at the State Department in Bogotá, ELN rebels took the embassy, and security got me out, but the rebels took hostages. Nick was deputy chief for the SHIELD station there. And he comes to me with a plan. He wants to storm the building through the sewers. I said, no, we'll negotiate. Turned out the ELN didn't negotiate, so they put out a kill order. They stormed the basement, and what did they find? Winter didn't remember this specifically, but he thought he might have been there. He tilted his head a little. What is it? Steve asked, having noticed Winter's expression of confusion. I think I was there, he said vaguely, gesturing towards the screen with a metal finger. He noticed that Stark was eyeing him now. Do you remember killing anyone who looked kinda like me, but older? The man asked. His voice was oddly distant. Winter's brow furrowed. He thought for a couple seconds. Had he? He didn't know. He had killed many people. How was he supposed to remember specifics? So he just shrugged. He couldn't say he hadn't killed whoever Stark was asking about, but he couldn't say he had either. They find it empty. Nick had ignored my direct order and carried out an unauthorized military operation on foreign soil. He saved the lives of a dozen political officers, including my daughter. Was the guy actually sick enough to try and kill his own daughter? Or was Pierce only making up stuff for Symphony? Winter wasn't sure if he really wanted to know. Looking around, he saw that most of the humans seemed to share his feelings on the matter. Steve Rogers. So you gave him a promotion. Alexander Pierce. I've never had any cause to regret it. Captain, why was Nick in your apartment last night? Ooh, busted. Stark practically sang, looking delighted at the tense movie versions of themselves. The captain rolled his eyes, glaring half-heartedly. Maybe Archer Clint smirked and repeated what Stark had said. Winter really couldn't understand these humans. What was Ras not funny? At all. Steve could be in danger in the future, and they were acting like children about it. He took a deep, calm breath, looking at the Avengers. It wasn't their fault. They were probably trying to lighten the atmosphere. Steve Rogers. I don't know. Alexander Pierce. You know it was bugged? Steve Rogers. I did, because Nick told me. The assassin wondered if the captain disliked this conversation as much as he did. He bet Steve did, since his future self was in danger. Winter sighed. Why was his life so messed up? Why couldn't he just be normal? Like he used to be. Why couldn't he live a real life? What had he done to make God hate him so much? Obviously, Bucky couldn't have been a bad person, not when Steve seemed to care about him so much. He fought back these thoughts. It wasn't helping anything. He would rest soon enough, or maybe he'd burn in hell. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that Steve would be alright. Alexander Pierce. Did he tell you he was the one who bugged it? Steve doesn't reply, obviously not knowing this information. I want you to see something. He brings up footage of Batroc being interrogated. SHIELD agent. Who hired you, Batroc? Was Pierce trying to frame Fury, or was he being honest? Winter didn't know, and that bothered him. He liked knowing stuff, so he could hold it over his enemies. He wasn't sure if that was a Winter Soldier thing or a Bucky Barnes thing. He didn't really care. Steve Rogers. Is that live? Alexander Pierce. Yeah, they picked him up last night in a not-so-safe house in Algiers. Steve Rogers. Are you saying he's a suspect? Assassination isn't Batroc's line. Alexander Pierce. No, it's more complicated than that. Batroc was hired anonymously to attack the Lemurian Star, and he was contacted by email and paid by wire transfer. And then the money was run through 17 fictitious accounts, the last one going to a holding company that was registered to a Jacob Veitch. Winter noticed Stark's eyes widening at that. Maybe he'd known this Veitch? Steve Rogers. Am I supposed to know who that is? He hands Steve the file. Alexander Pierce. Not likely. Veitch died 6 years ago. His last address was 14-35 Elmhurst Drive. When I first met Nick, his mother lived at 14-37. Steve Rogers. Are you saying Fury hired the pirates? Why? Alexander Pierce. The prevailing theory was that the hijacking was a cover for the acquisition and sale of classified intelligence. The sale went sour and that led to Nick's death. Yeah, no, that is not what happened. Winter scoffed, then paused. Well, Eyepatch may have hired the pirates. Steve looked at him with confusion. Why do you say that? Well, it's the same reason I was sent to kill Fury. He knew about Hydra, and all of those agents that were taken captive were probably Hydra. The assassin explained, and most of the humans nodded. Steve Rogers. If you really knew Nick Fury, you'd know that's not true. Well, under normal circumstances, Steve said, making his point. Everyone, minus Winter, nodded in agreement. I don't know, he looks like the kind of guy who'd like pirates. Winter couldn't help but say. Why's that? Natasha asked with narrowed green eyes. Winter shrugged, then gestured towards his eye, smirking under the mask as he did so. Stark and maybe Archer Clint fell over laughing, and Steve snickered a little. Natasha just glared at him half-heartedly. Alexander Pierce. Why do you think we're talking? See, I took a seat on the council not because I wanted to but because Nick asked me to, because we were both realists. We knew that despite all the diplomacy and the handshaking and the rhetoric, that to build a really better world sometimes means having to tear the old one down. And that makes enemies. Those people that call you dirty because you got the guts to stick your hands in the mud and try to build something better. And the idea that those people could be happy today makes me really, really angry. Some of that speech was lies, and other parts was truth. Pierce sure did want to tear the earth down, that was for sure. He wanted it to burn and bow to him. Winter didn't like burning and bowing, though he'd done it many, many times. He stiffened as a flashback hit him hard. The acid was kneeling on the ground, blood pouring from his nose and mouth, and various cuts on his body. His hair was matted with blood and grease, and he'd been stripped of his shirt, leaving him shivering in the cold. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way beneath him, making him sink back to the ground. Pain burned through him and blurred his vision. He felt a harsh hand jerk his chin up, making his already pounding headache increase. His icy blue eyes met Pierce's cold, emotionless blue eyes. Stand, soldier. The man hissed, slapping the acid and sending him tumbling onto his elbows. He tried to comply, he really did, but every time he got back up, he fell back down. Each time he fell, a whip slashed his back, over and over again. Until he just couldn't get back up. Pierce knelt down next to him, trailing the whip over a highly personal area before bringing him down hard. Winter jerked out of the flashback with a hard flinch, remembering the Fathom pains. He met Steve's worried eyes and shrugged. He hesitates a moment. Captain, you were the last one to see Nick alive. I don't think that's an accident, and I don't think you do either. So I'm gonna ask again, why was he there? Steve Rogers. He told me not to trust anyone. He was right. Winter thought with a grimace underneath the mask. Alexander Pierce. I wonder if that included him. Steve pauses a moment before replying. Steve Rogers. I'm sorry. Those were his last words. Excuse me. Steve picks up his shield, places it on his back and starts to make his out of the office. Alexander Pierce. Captain. Steve stops and looks at Pierce. Somebody murdered my friend and I'm gonna find out why. Anyone gets in my way, they're gonna regret it. Anyone. Winter almost laughed at the pure ridiculousness of that statement. You killed your friend, or well, technically I did. But you made me. Winter couldn't help but think. After all, Pierce probably did make Winter regret it. Okay, I don't normally do this, but I was just overcome by the urge to write Stabby instead of Winter. XD. Steve Rogers. Understood. Steve turns and leaves. Steve Rogers. After he leaves Pierce's office he steps into the elevator, operations control. Shield computer. Confirmed. Just as the elevator doors are about to close, Rumlow steps in with 2 strike agents. Brock Rumlow. Keep all strike personnel on site. Strike agent number 1. Understood. Strike agent number 2. Yes, sir. Brock Rumlow, forensics. Shield computer. Confirmed. Brock Rumlow. Cap. Steve Rogers. Rumlow. The elevator doors close and they start riding down. Everyone tensed at this. Steve's hand stilled on Winter's back, as the captain tensed at the scene in the movie. Winter felt tense and uncomfortable, but he managed to lift a hand, not the metal one, and put it on Steve's shoulder, trying to calm him. But Winter wasn't practiced in calm, he specialized in stabbing and murdering and stuff like that. It's a good thing you aren't having children. Winter couldn't help but smirk under his mask at that thought. Brock Rumlow. Evidence response found some fibers on the roof they want us to see. You want me to get the TAC team ready? Steve Rogers. No, let's wait and see what it is first. Brock Rumlow. Right. Steve notices one of the agents touching his weapon suspiciously. The elevator stops and more shield and strike agents enter. Shield agent number 1. What's the status so far? Shield agent number 2. Administration's level. Shield computer. Confirmed. Shield agent number 2. To Steve, excuse me. Brock Rumlow. To Steve, I'm sorry about what happened with Fury. Messed up, what happened to him? Steve Rogers. Thank you. Feeling something is off, Steve looks at the agents in the elevator and notices one of them is sweating. Then the elevator stops and more agents enter. Strike agent number 3. Records. Shield computer. Confirmed. As the ET realizes he's been surrounded by agents. Steve Rogers. Before we get started, does anyone want to get out? Fight, 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 Stark and maybe Archer Clint exclaimed, chanting and swinging their fists. Children. Natasha slapped his friend over the head, and Bruce scowled at Stark. The captain just looked amused. There's a moment's pause before suddenly one of the agents turns and uses an electric rod to give Steve a shock. The others grab him and try to strap his wrists with magnetic cuffs. Steve manages to knock some of them down, but one cuff remains. Then Rumlow uses his rod to give Steve a shock. As Steve is being attacked, we see Sidwell in a controls room watching them from a monitor. Jasper Sidwell. Mobilize strike units, 25th floor. Steve manages free himself from the magnetic cuff and knock all the agents down. He turns to Rumlow. Brock Rumlow. Whoa, big guy. I just want you to know, Cap, this ain't personal. It kind of looks personal. Winter said, eyeing Rumlow on the screen. Steve just shrugged, smiling a little at the assassin. Rumlow then goes to attack Steve with his electric rod, but Steve manages to defend himself and eventually knocks Rumlow out. Steve Rogers. It kind of feels personal. There was a long moment of silence, then both Winter and Steve looked at each other and fell over laughing. Winter couldn't remember laughing. Ever. But it felt good, like a kind of chattering goodness in the pit of his stomach. He knew the humans were staring at him in shock. He didn't really care, as long as Steve was laughing with him. Finally they stopped laughing and climbed into their seats, leaning into each other unconsciously, their shoulders brushing. Winter did notice Natasha's raised eyebrow. Steve picks up his shield, then opens the elevator doors, but he's faced by a team of strike agents pointing their weapons at him. 25th floor strike agent. Drop the shield. Put your hands in the air. Steve uses his shield to break off the elevator wires, which sends the elevator down. As he forces the doors open, he sees more strike agents approaching him. He closes the door and looks for a way out. Strike agent. Give it up, Rogers. Get that door open. You have nowhere to go. Steve breaks through the glass in the elevator and plummets down to finally hit the ground floor. From his monitor, Sidwell watches in shock as Steve gets up and starts running off. Jasper Sidwell. Are you kidding me? Ordering the strike team? He's headed for the garage. Lock down the bridge. Steve rides out of the SHIELD garage on his motorcycle, evading the obstacles laid out, but then a Quinjet emerges ahead of him. Quinjet pilot. Stand down, Captain Rogers. Stand down. The Quinjet lowers its machine gun. Repeat, stand down. As Steve doesn't stop, they start shooting at him. Steve throws his shield into the propellers to jam it, giving him an opportunity to hop onto it and do more damage to the jet with his shield before jumping off as the jet goes crashing down and he escapes. Everyone cheers and congratulates the captain on his successful escape. Except for Winter, he just sat there, but he showed his support of Steve's fighting skills by squeezing his shoulder. He didn't know why Steve felt so comfortable by him. Like heck, he was an evil, mind-controlled assassin. Why was the captain so comfortable just sitting there next to him? Jasper Sidwell. To the SHIELD agents. Eyes here. Everyone, including Agent 13, looks at Sidwell. Whatever your op is, bury it. This is level 1. Contact dot. All traffic lights in the district go red. Shut all runways at BWI, IAD and Reagan. All security cameras in the city go through this monitor, right here. Scan all open sources. Phones, computers, PDAs, whatever. If someone tweets about this guy, I want to know about it. Sharon Carter. With all due respect, if SHIELD is conducting a manhunt for Captain America, we deserve to know why. Yes. Tell her. Grumbled Steve, glaring at the Hydra agents. Winter joined in the glaring at Hydra agents happily. It was a fun game. Alexander Pierce. Because he lied to us. Pierce enters the room. Captain Rogers has information regarding the death of Director Fury. He refused to share it. As difficult as this is to accept, Captain America is a fugitive from SHIELD. Captain Rogers has information regarding my treachery that we can't let him spread. As difficult as this is to accept, Captain America is a good person, Stark said, impersonating Pierce's voice, causing most of the room to laugh at that. Winter smiled under his mask. He was glad that these would be the last faces he'd see. As annoying as Stark was, he had a good sense of humor. He distantly remembered someone like Stark, Howard Stark, maybe Tony Stark's father? Then he remembered Stark's question if he'd ever killed anyone that looked like him, and Winter did remember doing it now. The car. The women. Howard trying to trigger Winter's memory. Oh darn, what had he done? Yes, another chapter, yay. Thanks to the lovely crazy fangirl 1234 and everyone else who supports my story. PaleWolfsHowl. Natasha watched Steve interact with the man who had once shot a bullet through her. Not that she held a grudge, but still. The Winter Soldier, or Winter, was pretty messed up in the head. She understood why he might lean on someone as strong a cannibal as Steve. But she couldn't fathom why Steve was acting the way he was. How he looked at the assassin when Winter wasn't looking reminded Natasha of how she'd seen a close pair of brothers look at each other. It was odd, so very odd. She felt Clint take her hand, and she exchanged a look with her boyfriend. Disguised as a civilian dressed in a hoodie, snickers were heard at the mention of Steve's disguise. Natasha could practically feel the disapproval radiating from Winter at Steve's lack of hiding skills. Steve goes back to the hospital to retrieve the flash drive from the vending machine but sees it's gone. Then Natasha appears behind him chewing some gum. In anger, Steve pushes her into a room. More snickers were heard at that, and Natasha had to smirk. Oh, how she loved herself. Wait, what? Since when had she been Tony? Horror went through her at that thought. Steve Rogers. Where is it? Natasha Romanoff. Safe. Steve Rogers. Do better. Natasha Romanoff. Where did you get it? Steve Rogers. Why would I tell you? Natasha Romanoff. Fury gave it to you. Why? Steve Rogers. What's on it? Natasha Romanoff. I don't know. Steve Rogers. Stop lying, Natasha Romanoff. I only act like I know everything, Rogers. Natasha pouted at that line. Why'd she have to say that? Though really, that conversation was comedic gold. Clint seemed to agree, because he was smirking, as was Tony. Steve had raised his eyebrows at her, and Winter looked bored. Bruce looked like he was contemplating the goods and evil involving bubble gum. Everything was back to normal, except instead of Thor, they had an unstable, Hydra-controlled assassin. Steve Rogers. I bet you knew Fury hired the pirates, didn't you? Most undoubtedly, she said, smirking as Steve rolled his eyes at her. Sometimes, Natasha, sometimes. Captain America groaned, and Natasha saw Winter pat his shoulder, though she doubted he really felt bad for Steve. Natasha Romanoff. Well, it makes sense. The ship was dirty, Fury needed a way in, so do you. Steve Rogers. I'm not gonna ask you again. Natasha Romanoff. I know who killed Fury. Most of the intelligence community doesn't believe he exists, the ones who do call him the Winter Soldier. He's credited with over 24 assassinations in the last 50 years. Everyone glanced at Winter, who looked shameful. But then he did something that shocked everyone. He bowed mockingly, like someone would after acting in a play. Everyone chuckled. Even though it was horrible, it was still good that the assassin was now comfortable enough to make that joke. Steve Rogers. So he's a ghost story. Well, I'm not dead. Winter seemed to be out of control of himself. At first he'd been so quiet, now he couldn't seem to shut up. Steve rolled his eyes. Yeah, I know. I can clearly see you. That was definitely sarcasm in his voice. But can you? Winter asked in an odd voice, slightly whispery, and right out of a horror movie. Steve just rolled his eyes, and shoved Winter a little. Natasha just watched in bemusement. How had this happened? They barely knew each other. But Natasha was starting to doubt that, maybe Winter had known Steve before the war. It was possible, after all, Winter could be hundreds of years old for all they knew. Natasha Romanoff. 5 years ago I was escorting a nuclear engineer out of Iran. Somebody shot out my tires near Odessa. We lost control, went straight over a cliff. I pulled us out, but the Winter Soldier was there. I was covering my engineer, so he shot him straight through me. She pulls up her shirt to show him the scar on the side of her stomach. Soviet slug. No rifling. Bye-bye bikinis. Winter looked at her awkwardly. Sorry, about that. The man said regretfully, was it just her or did he have a tint of an ancient now? Unhearable to untrained ears, but she could hear it. Whoever the man had once been seemed to be slowly creeping back. Wasn't your fault. She dismissed it, and Winter nodded, before staring at the screen again. Steve Rogers. Yeah, I bet you look terrible in them now. There's a hit of a smile from Natasha. Natasha Romanoff. Going after him is a dead end. I know, I've tried. Dead end you say? I wonder why. It's not like you're tracking a mind-controlled assassin or something. Tony said sarcastically, making Winter huff in amusement. It's a dead end in more ways than one, he said cheerfully, making Steve smirk and whack him lightly on the shoulder. Natasha holds up the flash drive. Like you said, he's a ghost story. Steve takes the flash drive from her. Steve Rogers. Well, let's find out what the ghost wants. No, don't do that, you'll die. Winter complained, looking at Steve, and Natasha could have bet he was pouting underneath the muzzle thing. Steve shrugged. I'm hard to kill. Winter rolled his eyes. Sure, whatever you say. Natasha smirked at the two men. This was going to be amusing if Winter kept this newfound confidence. Though it seemed like he was trying to keep his mind off of something. Pierce is holding another virtual meeting with the World Security Council. Alexander Pierce. Nick Fury was murdered in cold blood. To any reasonable person, that would make him a martyr, not a traitor. Ugh. Natasha groaned at the man on the screen, like honestly. This was the man who'd ordered Fury's death. Even though it was hard, she was determined not to blame this on Winter. It wasn't his fault. Councilman Rockwell. You know what makes him a traitor? Hiring a mercenary to hijack his own ship. Councilman Sane. Nick Fury used your friendship to coerce this council into delaying Project Insight. A project he knew would expose his own illegal operations. At best, he lied to you. At worst. Alexander Pierce. Are you calling for my resignation? I've got a pen and paper right here. Councilwoman Holly. That discussion can be tabled for a later time. Alexander Pierce. But you do want to have a discussion. Councilman Rockwell. We've already had it, Mr. Secretary. This council moves to immediately reactivate Project Insight. If you want to say something snappy, now would be a good time. Natasha grimaced. This game was getting more and more dangerous as it went on. Like Russian roulette, she remembered that game well. Ah, the good, OL days.